Chapter 368. The gunman's action of raising the gun was very natural and smooth. It was even very beautiful, as if he had practiced it countless times. People who saw this scene would even completely ignore what he was holding in his hand. The crisp and slightly rough gunshot rang out under the blazing hot afternoon under the ancient pine trees on the cliff. A high-speed bullet shot out of the black barrel coldly towards Shula's chest. Shula was not shocked by the gunman's posture when he pulled out the gun, because he did not see it at all. When the gunman's right shoulder moved, the muscles on his left leg instantly entangled like silk and burst out with a great force. It shook his body to the right and fiercely rushed towards the gunman's body. On the cliff, on the ancient pine trees, and on the screen wall, the small-eyed man was like a grey dragon. His body trembled slightly, and in the blink of an eye, he had already rushed 3 meters. As long as Shula was close to the body, there were not many people in this universe who could effectively counterattack. This was a fact that had been proven by countless iron-blooded facts. It was very obvious that the assassin disguised as a staff member of the Lin family also knew this very well, so when the gunshot rang out, it was 3 consecutive shots. The first bullet brushed past the tiger-like Shula's body and shot into the screen wall with a whoosh. The gunman's wrist turned slightly between breaths, and he fired 2 shots in succession with great precision and great prediction. The invisible trajectory of the bullets in the air was like an extremely precise network that sealed the space in front of the gunman. The gunman's heart, eyes, and eyes cooperated with each other without any need for time. It was completely based on some kind of instinct formed by countless aiming shots. In just an instant, 3 shots were fired consecutively. Where the gunman's eyes aimed, the whistling bullets dragged the shadow of death as they shot towards the target. This kind of marksmanship was very good, very good. It had already reached a certain level, a level that made people want to slap the table and praise it. Since childhood, Shula had been practicing those 10 postures tirelessly day and night. That was why he was able to turn the skills that the uncle taught him into an instinct of his body. When facing a strong opponent, he didn't need to think, and he could let his body instinctively choose the most suitable way to deal with the opponent, as well as the sharpest attack method and angle. This person was the same, but he used a gun. The situation was very dangerous. No matter how fast Shula's movements were, even if he was about to turn into an afterimage, he was still not as fast as the shifting of his gaze. This was the so-called a glance of 10,000 miles. What was terrifying was that this assassin was able to display this ability through his powerful spear skills. No matter how strong he was, after the muscles in his body were bundled together, his resistance was as hard as a rock. However, he could not resist the bullets fired from such a large caliber pistol. He was walking on the road to becoming the best machine, but he could never really become an ice-cold alloy machine. 3 clear and continuous gunshots rang out at the same time, 1 shot into the wood, 1 shot into the sky. The sound was like the blood cry of a cold bird, the sound was heart-wrenching and tear-jerking. The last bullet seemed to be fired in a scattered manner, but it was the most sinister and terrifying. Shula let out a muffled groan. Relying on the enormous strength in his body, his ankle moved horizontally, his body forcefully falling to the right, a bright flower of blood spurting out from his shoulder. His knee fiercely smashed into the ground, and a burst of heart-wrenching pain suppressed the pain in his shoulder. Shula's face suddenly paled, and his eyes suddenly lit up. Before the pain could completely appear in his brain, and while the flower of blood was still spurting out from his shoulder, he once again rushed up. The seemingly thin young officer's body actually contained a terrifying amount of strength. There was a burst of extremely strange high-frequency trembling, and the military uniform on his body rustled. In the time it took for a spark to fly off a piece of flint, he used the vibration between his knee and the hard mountain rock to bounce up and once again pounce toward the gunman. The knuckles in his right fist slightly protruded, transforming into a stream of light that smashed toward the other's earlobe. At this distance, this gunman with astonishing marksmanship once again opened fire. Shula would not be able to dodge, but the gunman certainly would not be able to dodge Shula's punch that contained the power to kill. It seemed like a method of ending in the same end, a method of fighting to be the first to face off on a narrow path, but in reality, Shula had already calculated the result in his heart. It was impossible for the gunman's gun barrel to aim at his head in this instant. being shot in the body, as long as it was not the heart. Shula believed that with his monstrous body, tenacious life force, and bullshit luck that was like the last spaceship of the catastrophe, he should not die like this. Furthermore, the other party had received his punch. No matter how valiant the gunman was, he could only end up with his head exploding like a watermelon, dying on the spot. Therefore, this was not a mutual destruction, but using his own heavy injuries to exchange for the other's life. Shula had to do this in order to force the other party to have the intention to retreat. There was a gap in the gunshot because he had a feeling that although this gunman was a professional, he did not seem to be the type of professional assassin who was unafraid of death under the glory of the charter. It had to be known that in a social environment like the Federation, the business of assassination could only be done once. And the other party seemed to have some kind of wild ambition to survive from the very beginning. If he wanted to live, this gunman had to retreat. Shula firmly believed that at this moment, if the other party hurriedly withdrew his gun, he would definitely be able to keep him. However, he did not expect that the gunman would withdraw his gun earlier than he expected. At the same time the third shot was fired, the moment Shula erupted, the gunman let out a muffled groan, allowing the pistol to slip from his wide palm. He turned around and left. This was because his wrist had been pierced by a small knife that had flown from outer space. Blood gradually flowed out, making the small knife look even more delicate. Because of this sudden change, the time the gunman abandoned his gun and turned around to leave was an instant ahead of Shula's prediction. So, when he attacked with the wind, he only had time to use the right side of his trembling body to touch the side of the gunman's body. However, Shula's full-powered strike, even though it only brushed past the gunman, still gushed out with a huge force. With a few cracking sounds, it broke one of the gunman's ribs. Under the shadow of the hat, the gunman's face was still completely covered. His lower jaw was deathly white. However, even though he had suffered such a heavy injury, he only let out a muffled grunt before falling silent. Instead, he valiantly borrowed Shula's force to increase his pace as he ran toward the autumn forest. In front of the autumn forest, he encountered a delicate man. The delicate blade flashed twice by the autumn forest, and a fierce collision sound rang out. The gunman's thigh had been pierced by the delicate man's military knife, but in the end, he still bravely charged into the autumn forest. On the fallen leaves, the bloodstains suddenly disappeared. No one knew where they had gone. Shula narrowed his eyes as he looked into the depths of the forest. He turned back to look at Bai Yulon, whose right hand was trembling slightly. His heart was filled with infinite shock. This gunman not only had terrifying marksmanship, he was also so fierce in close combat. Shula knew very well how dangerous Bai Yulon was. Those souls that had died under Bai Yulon's delicate knife were even more clear. Shula also knew the lethality of his own body. In just a few breaths' time, the gunman had been heavily injured by Shula's headbutt, and had also been injured by Bai Yulon's treacherous sneak attack. Even so, the gunman had still managed to escape. He won't be able to escape from the wood valley. Bai Yulon lowered her head. Her pale face gradually recovered as she spoke softly. With such a heavy injury, can he still disguise himself as a normal person and walk out? Shula didn't ask the delicate man beside him how long he had been following him. Perhaps after Bai Yulon was discharged from the hospital, he had been secretly responsible for his safety. Many things had happened in the past, so he let them go with the knife in his back and today's delicate knife. Normal people can't, but this person definitely can. Bai Yulon's slightly wet black hair fell between her brows. He had thrown out a life-saving knife, which had pierced through the gunman's wrist, and then used a military knife to stab the gunman's thigh. It was just a short exchange, but it had already exhausted his mental and physical strength. Unfortunately, the last stab had brushed past the gunman's aorta. The delicate knife and military knife had both pierced the gunman's body, but the gunman had still managed to escape. Bai Yulon's eyes drooped slightly. Looking at her empty hands, a faint sense of loss arose in her heart. The gunshot had alarmed many people. How could Shula be worried about little Watermelon's safety? He knew that the Lin family would definitely not allow such a thing to happen. At this time, he didn't know how many people were looking for the gunman. Thinking of the gunman's extremely sharp and stunning 3 shots, as well as his valiant close combat escapability, even he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Professional but not professional, tenacious but silent, Xu Le and Bai Yulon looked at each other. They could see the shock and doubt in each other's eyes. Both of them thought at the same time that only the military could cultivate such a terrifying person today. Wood Valley was filled with distinguished guests. The Lin family, the Li family, the Nan family, the Federation's 7 great families that rarely appeared in public. 3 of them had actually chosen this place as their first choice for a holiday. It was precisely because of this that even though there was a shocking shooting in the manor, there was still no police report. The people in the 3 courtyards waited silently and calmly. The Lin family's security team, on the other hand, began to search the entire manor with ashen faces. Who dares to kill you? Who can hurt you? Li Xiaotong's gloomy face had already turned into shock. He stared at the wound on Xu Le's shoulder and said in a deep voice. Today, Xu Le was personally chosen by the old man, and the federal military focused on training him. Although he had a close relationship with the old man, if something happened to Xu Le today, it would be very difficult for him to explain to the Federation. The men from Group 7 had the same expression as him. They had directly received the military order from the Ministry of Defense to protect Xu Le. In the end, Xu Le had been shot right under their noses and had almost been in big trouble. That is an amazing master. Not only is his marksmanship good, but his skills are also very good. Xu Le was very serious and did not exaggerate his evaluation of the gunman. Hearing the words marksmanship good, Xiong Lingquan narrowed his eyes and revealed a trace of coldness. However, because of the words of the delicate man behind him, it turned into shock. Bai Yulon, who was leaning against the wall, whispered softly, "That person's marksmanship is much better than Xiongzi's." Xu Le glanced at Brother Zheng, who had finally appeared behind Li Xiaotong, and said, "That person's close combat skills should be only a little worse than Brother Zheng's." Li Xiaotong's expression finally changed. He said faintly, "The Federation strictly controls firearms. Although there are definitely some on the black market, generally, people on the black market are not willing to sell to killers. The killers in the Federation are all one-off transactions. Therefore, they are not willing to let the government investigate them. I think that the gun you got should be from the front line of the Westwoods. It might even be an Empire product. Don't expect to find anything like this. If he really can escape from Wood Valley at this time, unless we immediately apply to the Bureau of Proclamation, no one will be able to find the mastermind if he escapes to Bermuda." Chapter 369. Xu Le was sitting on a flatbed that was half the height of a person. At this moment, when he raised his head, his previously silent and slightly shaken body suddenly straightened up. He opened his eyes. Although he was not sleepy, he did not have much energy, so he directly came to a conclusion. However, his normal tone of voice made the people around him unable to raise too many doubts. He tapped the ash on the black stone ashtray beside him. He used 2 fingers to hold the slightly hot cigarette and took a deep puff. Li Xiaotong naturally smoked the best quality tobacco to entertain him. However, when he was thinking, he still habitually smoked a blue box of brand 37 cigarettes. It was easy to go from frugality to extravagance, and for him, it was not difficult to go from extravagance to frugality. After all, as an orphan who did not have much experience with extravagance during his childhood, Xu Le was still more used to the slightly dry and coarse taste of brand 37 cigarettes. This might have something to do with his love for the past to a certain extent. Brand 37 cigarettes were neither expensive nor cheap. The price was moderate. If an engineer held a cigarette in his hand and stared at the design blueprint on the workbench, people would feel that it was very natural and very compatible. However, if the youngest lieutenant colonel in the Federation held a cigarette and acted like he was thinking, people would easily feel that this person was too pretentious. Not to mention the allowance from the Ministry of Defense, the benefits of the military would make any lieutenant colonel feel that smoking this kind of cigarette was very degrading. However, Xu Le just sipped and smoked like this, just like how he smoked and chatted with Shi Qinghai behind the iron gate of Yue University 3 years ago. It was very natural, just like how he gave his own judgment without any reason at this moment. He sat cross-legged on the bed like a Bermuda specialty charlatan, but it was hard for people to feel suspicious or shocked. He's in the 6th courtyard. He's preparing to sneak out with the people inside. Shula narrowed his eyes and whispered in the smoke-filled room, which made the atmosphere around him even weirder. Only he knew where his confidence came from. The Federation government probably would not apply to the Bureau of Proclamation any faster than he did now. During the moment when he closed his eyes and meditated, he had already confirmed the identity of the gunman through the old guy in the Bureau of Proclamation and started to track that person's location in real time. At this moment, he was not talking about the old man in Philadelphia, but Shula. With the full cooperation of the Federal Central Computer, no matter how powerful the person was, he would not be able to escape from his eyes. Lin Dohai and the people from Green Dragon Mountain are in that courtyard. Li Xiaotong's face was a little gloomy as he reminded him. Shula stubbed out the cigarette in the cold stone ashtray, nodded, got up, and walked out of the courtyard. Bai Yulon lowered her head and followed closely behind him, followed by the gloomy men in the 7th courtyard. The young lady of the Zhong family, who had no choice but to stop the tour, was obviously more mature than the average young girl. She did not yell or make a scene, but carefully observed the strange expressions of Shula and the adults. She quietly held the slightly old doll in her arms and followed behind the crowd. Shula was worried that leaving her in the 1st courtyard would give some people an opportunity to take advantage of her, so he simply took her with him and gave the men in the 7th courtyard a death order. He was not worried about the little girl's safety. Instead, when he walked in the gloomy forest in the afternoon, he thought of the Prime Minister Nan's family, who was also on vacation in the Wood Valley Manor, and the beautiful and shy girl. "You mean to say that the gunman is among the people behind me?" Lin Dohai, who was wearing a light brown hemp suit, frowned deeply. He wanted to show a trace of depth that didn't match his shrewdness. He looked at Shula, who was in front of him, and said mockingly, "What a stupid judgment. Wood Valley is the property of the Lin family. I admit that I hate you, and young Master Nan must not have a good impression of you either. But I will not do such a thing in this courtyard." Lin Dohai slightly raised his chin and said disdainfully, "We just had a conflict at noon. Do you think I will be stupid enough to immediately send someone to kill you? It is obvious that someone wants to take this opportunity to stir up trouble. As an engineer, can you please use your brain more? Other than mechanical things, you should also learn a little bit of the ways of the world." Lin Dohai's explanation was very reasonable. Although the children of the 7 great families were arrogant and stupid, the education they received since childhood prevented them from doing such stupid things that would only bring endless trouble to their families. Shula lowered his head and listened quietly. He did not say anything to refute. He did not even look at the bodyguards behind Lin Dohai and Nan Mingxiu, because he was sure that the powerful gunman was there, among the security team of the Lin family. Also for safety, he did not look at the gunman. He glanced at him from the corner of his eyes, and his heart was filled with infinite shock. This person's ribs were broken by him, and he was stabbed twice by Yulon. This person could still hold on until now. There was not a trace of blood on his body, and he could walk as usual. He even tried to sneak out of the manor through the Lin family. This kind of determination and means was either extremely arrogant or extremely crazy. Because he did not know if the gunman still had a gun in his hand, Shula lowered his eyes and did not want to take the risk. But he also did not want to let such a dangerous person, who was determined to assassinate little Watermelon, escape from under his nose. "Your people don't represent what you think." Li Xiaotong, who was cold all over, suddenly interrupted, "Dohai, your analysis is very reasonable, but maybe some people are just like us, so they deliberately want to take advantage of this loophole." Regarding the fixed mindset, in the corner of the manor where the situation was very tense, there was no need to have too deep a discussion. But the sudden interruption of the 7th young master of the Li family was more worthy of everyone's consideration. Among the 7 families of the Federation, the Li and Lin families had always been on good terms. At this time, Li Xiaotong did not hesitate to stand on Shula's side. To put it bluntly, this outstanding person who had always been seeking the inheritance of the Li family was also taking a big gamble. It was just to see how much he would get in the end. After the 7th young master of the Li family spoke, Lin Dohai was slightly stunned. His face became extremely ugly, and he looked at him with a cold gaze. Then he immediately looked at Shu Le and said with a cold smile, "I have so many people on my side. Do you want to check them one by one? According to what you said, he was stabbed in the thigh by your people. Do you want all of us to take off our pants for you to see? Fuck. Do you want me to take off my pants for you to see?" Lin Dohai angrily cursed. "I didn't say I wanted to take off my pants." Shu Le lowered his head and looked at the tips of his military boots that were constantly stepping on the bumpy ground. He said, "But you have to give me time to check." Bai Yulon was behind him, blocking in front of Zhong Yang. The black hair on his forehead covered most of his cold eyes. He carefully checked the bodyguards for a long time, but still couldn't find who that person was. He didn't know where Shu Le's confidence came from. Because he already had a plan in mind, Shu Le didn't say the fact that the gunman's palm was injured. Out of the corner of his eyes, he looked at the security personnel wearing grey overalls behind Lin Dohai. One of his hands pressed on the sound receiver in his ear. "Move out of the way. Master Nan and I don't have time to play this game with you." Lin Dohai lightly waved his finger. The security personnel of the Lin family and the special guards of Green Dragon Mountain prepared to open the way. Shu Le raised his head and looked at the armed personnel in front of him. His eyebrows gradually rose like flying knives. He said seriously, "I know you're inside. If I forcefully take care of you now, there are too many people here. There may be accidental injuries. If you just want to kill me, I may let you go with the others. Then I'll follow your shadow and kill you." In the quiet woods of the Wood Valley Manor, the people on the road heard this and suddenly felt a chill. Those who knew of Shu Le's violent deeds, such as Lin Dohai and Nan Mingxiu, felt a layer of ice form on their hearts. But the rest of the people heard the certainty and persistence in these words. "Unless you kill me first. In the current federation, it's too easy for me to kill someone." Shu Le looked at the people on the road and said, "But I can't let you go today. Because the person you want to kill is a little girl, and a little friend that I cherish very much. You're also an expert. You're clearly someone from the military. You actually came up with such a crazy plan. I can't let you go. Shu Le, you blocked my way. You said that my people want to kill you, or kill someone. I don't care. You're slapping my face. In a situation where I promised, you're still slapping my face." Lin Dohai stared at the little girl behind Shu Le, whose blue school uniform was faintly visible. He said gloomily, "Whose little girl is this? She's fine. Is she more important than the face of my Lin family and Green Dragon Mountain combined?" Speaking to this point, it was impossible for either side to back down. The security personnel of that side began to prepare to forcefully open up a path. The Federation strictly controlled firearms. Even the Lin family's security personnel did not dare to brazenly carry guns. On Shu Le's side, only Xiong Lingquan carried a gun. Thus, facing the Green Dragon Mountain special guards that gradually raised their gun muzzles, even though the men of Group 7 did not back down, their pupils gradually constricted. They discovered that this matter was indeed very thorny. Whoever had more guns had the loudest voice. In the universe, in the political arena of the Federation, as well as in the countless small disturbances, this rule had always been coldly enforced. Lin Dohai, I promise you that this little girl's safety is definitely more important than the face of your family and Green Dragon Mountain's group of bumpkins added together. The one who said these words was not Shu Le, even though he should be the only one here who knew Zhong Huiyan's true identity. The one who said these words was a fatty. A fatty who walked out from the forest. He was all smiles like a comic actor. His two slits of eyes sparkled with Lin Hu's fierce light. Fatty Tian. The West Woods military's secret-level expert Fatty Tian slowly walked out from the forest. It was as if he had never left the Zhong family's little princess for even a moment. Following his appearance, 20 or so ghost-like special guards of the Westwoods also spread out from the forest, behind the rocks, and under the flowers. They raised their black and incomparably cold KN gun barrels and surrounded the Lin family security personnel and the Green Dragon Mountain special guards. It's about reactivating the invincible state. Yes, I'm going home, haha. Chapter 370. It was another day and night on the road. Just as I was about to finish writing today's chapter, I was physically and mentally exhausted. I would like to have a good night's sleep and continue to activate invincibility tomorrow. Yep, everyone knows that for me, writing 3 chapters a day is already my invincibility. Of course, my invincibility is only the norm for others. Humans can only compare with themselves. After a week, the monthly votes list was horrible to look at. Haha, that's to be expected. It doesn't matter if I write less. It's impossible for me to catch up, but the later chapters are going to explode. It seems that I can continue writing like this. However, thinking about it quietly, I can't lack the urge to work hard and the means to pressure myself. I have to continue working hard. That's because during the annual selection, everyone gave me a lot of face. I have to do the same. This is mainly because of my own professionalism. I need courage and murderous intent. I don't need to recover any statuses. As long as I work hard, there will be statuses. That's why I'm going to activate invincibility tomorrow. What about the monthly votes? Let's join in the fun and cheer for my hardworking statuses. Thinking of what Tomato did in the past, let's pretend to imitate him. For the next 24 hours, let's all throw in monthly votes to play. An extra 100 votes means I'll be invincible for one more day. It's 9:40 now. That means that by 9:40 tomorrow, if I get an extra 100 votes, I'll be invincible for one more day. Damn, this doesn't seem to be invincible at all. Anyway, if my comrades and brothers want to play, then let's play. If I get an extra few hundred votes, I promise to update 3 chapters for as many days as possible. Actually, I'm still quite short of the 180,000 votes I promised this month. Alright, actually, whether you guys throw in votes or not, I'll make sure to update 3 chapters in a row. Chapter 371. The Westwoods region was far beyond the Sea of Stars. Although the distance between the region and the capital ring was not further than that of the Eastwoods region, due to the existence of the Zhong family of Millennium and that tiger, the region had always appeared to be at odds with the federal government. The glory of the Charter, which was all over the universe, could ensure that the entire Federation would always be united, but it could not erase the most sinister speculations in people's hearts about the situation, and the Federation's secret vigilance and displeasure toward the Westwoods people. The capital ring and the Westwoods had a history of friendship, gratitude, and resentment. This tradition was so old that no one trusted the other. Although the tiger in the Westwoods would never betray the Federation and fight against the glory of the Charter, the Federation government still felt a headache and anger toward the almost independent kingdom, the warlord that almost no one could control. This was President Sieg's private comment a few years ago. This was a historical tradition, and the Federation government was also following a historical tradition that was not very beautiful. Just like the dynasty era long ago, the heir of the Zhong family in the Westwoods must grow up in the capital ring. The government leaders could say that this arrangement was to let the heir of the Zhong family in the Westwoods receive the education of the Federation from a young age to cultivate a kind of spiritual quality that was close to the capital ring. The politicians could comfort themselves that this was a gentle and subtle influence, but deep down, everyone knew that this was just asking the Zhong family in the Westwoods to let a hostage in the capital ring. In the era of the democratic charter in the universe, the Federation government still had to use such a feudal and boring method, which was a deep sorrow. Therefore, regarding this issue, there was no record of the meeting in the President's mansion, no words in the closed-door discussion on Parliament Hill, and no word in the media or on the internet. People just followed the historical tradition, respectfully and awkwardly accepted the fact that a little girl was taken away from her father to a distant hometown. 3 years ago, when Shula ran into Little Watermelon on the Antique Bell, it was the most important development of a hostage situation in the Federation's modern society. Faced with the will of the entire Federation, the Zhong family of the Westwoods could only silently accept this ancient tradition. The little princess of the Zhong family of the Westwoods, Zhong Huahua, played the role of a hostage in the capital ring that no one knew about. Of course, her life was never troubled. She enjoyed security measures and respect that her peers never enjoyed. To appease the tiger of the Zhong family of the Westwoods, The Federation even passed a secret special regulation. The relevant content of the special regulations was that in today's extremely strict gun control, the Federation government still allowed the Westwoods military to specially dispatch a special force to legally carry heavy firearms and act as the Little Princess's security force. At this moment, the armed soldiers who walked out from behind the trees, under the flowers, and beside the rocks in the Wood Valley Manor were precisely a squad of this small security force. Fatty Tien, who was full of smiles, cold, and somewhat arrogant, was the highest-ranking officer behind the scenes of this security minister. For them, Zhong Huiyan's safety was absolutely the most important. No matter who tried to hurt her, it was not allowed to happen. The federal government had given Green Dragon Mountain's representative team an extremely high level of courtesy, allowing Green Dragon Mountain's Special Guard Battalion soldiers to carry firearms. However, in front of the Siling Zhong family security forces that had obtained a secret clause, in front of those ice-cold KN light machine gun barrels, their firepower immediately appeared somewhat shabby. The Green Dragon Mountain soldiers nervously surrounded Nan Mingxiu in the crowd. The barrels in their hands were slightly raised, and they did not confront the sudden appearance of these armed men. They were professional soldiers, but they maintained their posture of holding their guns at any time. They did not want to drag the situation into an even more tense situation when they were outnumbered. Lin Dohai's face was gloomy as he looked at the group of soldiers who had intruded on his property. Because of his anger, he lost some of his rationality and did not determine the identity of these soldiers. Just as he was about to explode, his sleeve was gently pulled by someone. Pulling one's sleeve was a very secretive and careful action, so it seemed a bit feminine. At this time, the person pulling Lin Dohai's sleeve was a strong man. His name was Kong Wu, and he was the personal bodyguard of the old master of the Lin family. For such a person to make such a feminine action, there must be a deep meaning behind it. Although Lin Dohai had always thought of this short and strong close combat expert as an old servant, he knew Kong Wu's eyes very well. He subconsciously felt a chill in his heart and shut his mouth. After the incident, Kong Wu had been silently standing behind Lin Dohai. As the #1 bodyguard of the Lin family, he was over 40 years old and had long since passed the age of fighting. Especially when he saw Xu Le and that delicate man surnamed Bai, Kong Wu couldn't help but think of July wildfire that night in Harbor City and the bone fracture on his thigh. That night in Harbor City, Xu Le and Bai Yulon had worked together and knocked him down with only one move. At that time, he had cried out in panic that Xu Le's surname should be Li. Now, more than a year had passed, and the Lees of Philadelphia were standing behind Xu Le. In a sense, this proved his judgment. He had become more and more cautious, and even a bit fearful. When Fatty Tien walked out of the forest without a sound or warning, Kong Wu's heart burst with alarm. He actually suppressed his vigilance toward Xu Le and Bai Yulon. Without hesitation, he pulled on Lin Dohai's sleeve to stop him from speaking. "What is your name?" Kong Wu stared at Fatty Tien's somewhat familiar face and asked in a hoarse voice, "Have we met before?" "Kong Wu." Fatty Tien narrowed his eyes and walked into the crowd. He didn't care about the Green Dragon Mountain Special Guard Battalion soldiers who were pointing their guns at the ground. He looked at Kong Wu and said with a smile, "It's been 20 years since I left the body cultivation hall. I didn't expect to see an old man from back then." Kong Wu's short and stout body suddenly emitted a trace of coldness. From Fatty Tien's answer, he naturally thought of an apprentice he had seen in the body cultivation hall in Philadelphia. At first, everyone thought that this apprentice was harmless, but later found to be a great disaster. After confirming the identity of this fatty and these soldiers, Kong Wu didn't say anything else. He simply said, "You guys investigate." Lin Dohai's expression suddenly changed. Just as he was about to reprimand Kong Wu, he felt a burning sensation on his wrist. With a cold face, Kong Wu forcibly dragged his young master to the side and made way for Fatty Tien. At the same time, he gave Lin Dohai a cold look, expressing a strong warning. Fatty Tien was slightly startled, then immediately smiled amiably. He walked straight into the group of Lin family security personnel. He was as calm and relaxed as when he had first appeared. It was as if he had returned to his hometown and seen an old friend he hadn't seen in a long time. Xu Le, who was standing outside the crowd, had been quietly watching this scene. Even though he knew that the powerful gunman was right beside Fatty Tien, he didn't feel too worried about him. He didn't know why, but he always had endless confidence in Fatty Tien, this expert hidden in the Westwoods military. But in order to show the way for Fatty Tien, he still tilted his head slightly and glanced at the Lin family security personnel wearing grey overalls with his right hand covering his earpiece. The Lin family security personnel wearing grey overalls was the extremely powerful gunman. As if he felt Shula's gaze, he suddenly moved and rushed to the right at an incredible speed. There was a gap there. Whether it was Shula's men or Fatty Tien's experienced special forces soldiers, none of them noticed the wetland where the spring was located. The gunman's reaction was so fast that no one present could react. Naturally, there was no chaos. However, he bumped into a wall of cotton. The wall of cotton was Fatty Tien's thick chest and abdomen. No one knew how Fatty Tien, who had been on the left, recognized the gunman's identity, and how he moved more than 5 meters in a flash to block the gunman's path of retreat. A cold light flashed in the gunman's right hand, and a sharp blade slid toward Fatty Tien's throat. The burned wound on his right palm finally burst open, and blood gushed out. Fatty Tien raised his left hand and slapped the gunman's wrist cleanly. The blade sank into the ground with a whoosh. A pistol appeared in the gunman's left hand at some point. However, before his finger could touch the cold trigger, his wrist was gently brushed by 3 fat fingers. The 3 fat fingers were extremely gentle, but also extremely terrifying. The gunman's wrist went numb as if he had been electrocuted. He could no longer hold his most powerful gun. Puff, 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 puff. There was a burst of dense noise, like countless sticks hitting a wall of cotton. Then, silence. The gunner's face was pale and his appearance was ordinary. Blood kept flowing out of his pale lips. He looked at the chubby and amiable face in front of him and couldn't help but move the corners of his lips. He laughed self-deprecatingly and said in a hoarse voice, "Please do it." In the previous few seconds, the gunman had used all of his trump cards to fight for his life. However, the hateful and terrifying fat man in front of him only moved his hand and made all of his fierce attacks futile. Even the gun fell into the hands of the fat man. Fatty Tien clumsily held the gun in his right hand and pointed it at the gunman's throat. After hearing what was said, he thought in silence and then said, "Shula." Shula's eyes widened. Although he couldn't believe it, he still took a step to the right and used his body to block Zhong Huiyen's curious gaze. There was a crisp sound, but it wasn't loud. Blood spurted out from the gunman's throat. His cervical vertebrae were shattered, and he fell down with a crack. Fatty Tien looked down at the corpse under him. His broad right hand clumsily held the gun, as if he was studying something. Everyone present had been shocked speechless by this scene. In addition to being shocked that this fat man really dared to shoot and kill on the spot, they were even more shocked by the terrifying and almost ordinary super strength he had shown when he intercepted the gunman. Lin Dohai looked at Fatty Tien with a pale face. He finally guessed the identity of the other party. Only now did he know why Uncle Kong didn't even care about the difference in seniority and pulled him away. The 7th young master of the Li family looked at Fatty Tien, who walked past him and bowed slightly. He asked very politely, "May I ask if you are Colonel Tien Da-Chang?" Chapter 372. In the villa in Shixia State, Shula once heard Mrs. Zhong mention the past. Fatty Tien was stripped of his military rank because he beat Du Shaoqing, the rising star of the military at that time, into a snowball demon, leaving a very dark record in his file. Fatty Tien was promoted to colonel at the age of 33 because of his military exploits, but because of the problems in his file, he had no hope of attaching a general star on his shoulder in this lifetime, so he was dejectedly discharged. So when he heard Li Xiaotong call him Colonel Tien, he knew that the 7th young master didn't mistake him for someone else, but he had a strange feeling in his heart. Colonel Tien? The combination of this name and military rank really made people feel a little uncomfortable. What made him feel strange was Li Xiaotong's respectful attitude at this time, and Lin Dohai's silent performance not far away. With the influence and status of the 7 major families in the Federation, a retired colonel definitely couldn't make Li Xiaotong so respectful. Fatty Tien killed that gunman on the spot. Although everyone saw that it was the gunman who took out the gun first, that gunman was after all a security member of the Lin family. Lin Do-hai, who was always stupid, presumptuous and arrogant, actually became so honest. Was it because of Fatty Tien? I'm Tien Da Tien, what can I do for you, seventh young master? Fatty Tien looked at Li Xiaotong with a smile, his hand still clumsily holding the gun that had just killed someone, but his smile was full of enthusiasm and friendliness. Li Xiaotong couldn't forget that this person had just killed a powerful gunman, so he felt a chill in his heart and said with a bitter smile, "Don't tease me, Colonel Tien, I just want to say hello to you." After saying this, Li Xiaotong hurriedly stepped aside. Fatty Tien didn't mind and walked over with a smile on his face. At this time, there was a middle-aged housekeeper at the periphery of the crowd. She gently greeted Fatty Tien and said, "Colonel Tien, the elders of the family want to invite you over for a chat." Today, the third party in the Wood Valley Manor, the Nan Xiong family, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. The first voice had nothing to do with the cold current faintly flowing in the manor. Instead, it invited this seemingly ordinary Fatty Tien over for a chat. The Nanxiang family was one of the 7 great families, and they were very strict with their family. They were different from the Tai family, who hid behind the scenes. They were truly low-key, and were even quieter than the 2 families in S3. However, such a family had issued a cordial invitation to Fatty Tien. This kind of attitude was undoubtedly a shocking education for some people who didn't know the power that Fatty Tien belonged to, or for people like Shula who didn't know about Fatty Tien's past deeds. "You're too polite." Fatty Tien replied with a smile, "It's just that I still have something to do today, so I won't bother you." Previously, he had coldly killed people and vividly displayed his strength. Now, he turned around and greeted people with a smiling face. He was cordial and pleasant, and even had a trace of cautious modesty. When people saw this, they didn't know how many complicated feelings rose in their hearts. The housekeeper only came to express her attitude on behalf of the Nan Xiong family. Obviously, she had predicted this person's answer. She was not surprised. She bowed with a smile and said, "Colonel Tien, today's matter, if you need, my family is willing to be a witness for you." "That's good. Thank you, Madam Nan Xiong." Fatty Tien's cordial face contained a trace of complicated emotions. He didn't know how he could conclude that the Nan Xiong family who came to the Wood Valley to celebrate the early autumn festival today, was Madam Shu Le, who was about to turn and leave, silently watched Fatty Tien and the Nan Xiong family's person talk cordially. In the end, he couldn't hold back the question in his heart. He asked Li Xiaotong, "You all know Fatty Tien?" Back then, he was the first general under the Tiger of the West Woods. Although he is no longer on the stage and we have never seen him, we must remember his name. Li Xiaotong looked at Fatty Tien's broad back and said, "But we respect him and fear him. He has little to do with the West Woods. Tien Da Bang is the predecessor of Yu and Lin Banshan. He was the most unruly person in the Federation back then. I heard from the elders in my family that when Tien Da Bang was young, he had pretended to be an apprentice of 14 cultivation halls in Feiqing City and then picked 14 of them." Li Xiaotong smiled bitterly and said, "If it wasn't for the Li family in Feiqing City, I really don't know how big of a disturbance he would have caused." Later, he joined the army and caused a lot of trouble in the front line. Fortunately, the Tiger of the West Woods was able to suppress him. Hearing the words cultivation hall, Shula naturally thought of Fatty Tien's suggestion on the ancient Bell spaceship 3 years ago. But at this moment, he was thinking more about how the young Fatty Tien could actually be so crazy under the eyes of the old master in Feiqing City. He was really an extraordinary person. But he didn't know if he was also a fatty when he was young. There are many stories about Tien Da Bang. But since you are so close to the Zhong family in the Westwoods and even the little fireworks princess calls you brother, you can ask this kind of thing yourself. Li Chishao's tone had a trace of displeasure as he spoke. Until now, he was sure that the little girl brought by Shu Le was the untouchable little princess of the Zhong family in the Westwoods. When he thought that Shu Le had such a close relationship with the Zhong family in the Westwoods, he couldn't help but feel a little dissatisfied. But this dissatisfaction was still limited to the category of friends. At this moment, he was lamenting about Shula's luck. The Li family, the Tai family, the Zhong family, this kind of luck should be considered heaven-defying in the Federation. If he knew about the confession of the Nan family's daughter in the secluded woods, he would probably be even more speechless. Shula knew what he was complaining about. He scratched his head and explained, "I know little Watermelon, the little princess of the Zhong family. It was really just an accident, it happened 3 years ago. Mu Tani was in trouble today, so he didn't have time to complain about the family history of the revolutionary nanny, so he stopped abruptly." But as he spoke, Shula couldn't help but think about the escape route Uncle Feng Yu left for him. That was how he met little Watermelon, entered Yue University, and met Tai Jiyuan. If all of this was really arranged by his uncle, then that guy was too close to a demon. And why did he make such arrangements before he died? The manor was in chaos, but people couldn't leave. At the edge of the secluded woods, Shula asked Fatty Tian seriously, "How did you know that the man in grey was the gunman? And how did you know?" Fatty Tian looked at Shula with a smile and asked in return. Shula mimicked Lan Xiaolong and shrugged. He had to avoid the question because he couldn't explain it. Fatty Tian was silent for a moment, then suddenly smiled and sniffed the air. He said lightly, "That person had the burning smell of Type 2 gunpowder on him." Shula immediately understood. The gunman used the powder in the bullet to stop the bleeding after he was injured, and it was this smell that led Fatty Tian to find the trace. "Then why did you want to kill him?" Shula looked at Fatty Tian's soft hands that were hanging by his waist and asked in a soft voice. "Because he was very dangerous." Fatty Tian turned around and looked at Shula. He said, "Although he was injured by you and your men, he was still very dangerous at the time. In fact, for such a dangerous expert, even if we caught him, we wouldn't be able to find out who the mastermind was. Since that was the case, I would rather kill him on the spot to intimidate some people." Who were those people, and why would they choose this moment to assassinate Proton Zhongyang, who was placed in the Federation by the Zhong family in the Westwoods? Shula was silent for a moment, and a chill crept into his heart. He muttered, "But if we leave him alive, maybe we can get something out of him." Who would believe it if we got something out of him? Even if the bastards of the Empire have been keeping an eye on us, the hostility from the Federation has never decreased. Fatty Tian looked at him with a hint of mockery and said, "If I said that it was the Iron 7 Division who did it, would you believe me?" Shula thought seriously for a long time, and then shook his head. Any logical person would not agree with Fatty Tian's crazy inference. Killing the heir of the Zhong family in the Westwoods would not benefit the Iron 7 Division and Du Shaoqing in any way. More importantly, Du Shaoqing was a model of a professional soldier. He would never completely ignore the overall situation at the front line of the Westwoods because of a personal grudge. The iron-blooded soldiers might be violent, competitive, and vengeful, but they were not crazy people. Seeing him shake his head, Fatty Tian laughed out loud, but there was suddenly a hint of weathered ruthlessness in his laughter that was completely inconsistent with his body shape. Not long after, the detectives from the Capital Police Bureau and the Federation Investigation Bureau came to the Wood Cove Manor and began the investigation of the incident with pain and anger. No matter who it was, the government would never allow anyone to hurt the little princess sent to the Federation by the Zhong family in the Westwoods. After killing the gunman, Fatty Tian left a simple statement and contact information. He then picked up Zhongyang and left under the protection of his powerful Westwood Special Forces, ignoring the flashing police lights at the entrance of the manor and the ashen-faced detectives in trench coats. This person came and left leisurely, leaving behind the body of a powerful gunman, a tyrannical figure, and a yard of silent shock. "Goodbye, brother Shula." Shula stood at the edge of the quiet autumn forest in the Wood Cove Manor and watched the convoy leave. He thought of the little girl's crisp farewell, and a sincere smile appeared on his ordinary face. The holidays were coming to an end, and he didn't know if he would see this little girl again in the future. Thinking of Zhongyang's delicate little face, the shadow in his heart naturally faded a little. He subconsciously looked back. He knew that the Federation Investigation Bureau and the Police Bureau wouldn't make things difficult for the Nan family, but he couldn't help but be curious. If that beautiful girl knew the story, what kind of expression would she have? In an apartment across the street from the Department of National Defense Training Center in the Capital Special Administrative Region, an officer was looking at the street scene under the autumn sun through a light-filtering film. His right hand was tightly holding an encrypted phone, but it revealed his true emotions at the moment. This light-filtering film could prevent the thermal imaging system from looking in, so he wasn't worried about his real face being seen by others while standing behind the window. However, he still pressed his military cap low and let the shadow cover most of his face, just like the gunman who died in the manor today. "The mission failed again," said a subordinate beside him with a gloomy face. Chapter 373. The military officer standing outside the window gazing into the distance had a standard military posture, not a hair out of place. The military cap on his head was worn very carefully, every strand of hair was carefully pressed into the brim of the cap. When he heard his subordinate's sigh, the thin lips exposed outside the shadows slightly pursed, his expression somewhat indifferent and gloomy. 2 years ago on New Year's Eve, we had already failed, but reality has proven that a failure on the surface can still be exchanged for the final success. The military officer's low voice sounded within the room. 2 years ago, there were many things I didn't understand, but now I understand, and I no longer consider myself a small figure. Because even though I am a small individual, I am part of a powerful collective, participating in the major events of the Federation, so each and every one of us are important figures. The subordinate behind him stood ramrod straight. Even though this person couldn't come into contact with more specific information from the upper echelons, when he heard the military officer's words, he still felt his blood boil. Even without these hot-blooded calls, as a soldier, he would do his best to complete any mission given to him by his superiors, and he wouldn't have any doubts. The military officer waved his hand, having his subordinate leave the room to deal with the follow-up matters, but he himself still stood in front of the window, staring blankly at the Ministry of Defense building across the street and the training center next to it through the filter film. He was still in this apartment full of military officers. Even though it was only a change of unit, he wasn't worried about being discovered. Then, he thought of the 1st of January 2 years ago. It seemed like it was just a repeat of failure, but these 2 failures, for him, were extremely different. The first failure, the important figure he followed cooperated with Senator Macklin, jointly providing information to the young officers of the 2nd Military Region to launch a surprise attack on Lin High Gymnasium. During this process, he was only a bystander. The memories of failure, for him, weren't too painful. Instead, it was Senator Macklin, that middle-aged man who was used to wearing synthetic sweaters. It was rumored that he died in the end, and only then was Senator Macklin exposed. The military officer originally wanted to take out a cigarette, but because of this, he reminded himself that he couldn't leave behind any habitual traces, couldn't give those investigators in the Federation any chance to find out. But this time, the officer was a true participant in this failure. That top-notch gunner who had died in the Wood Valley Manor was a peer he had befriended when he was young. He was an extremely outstanding professional soldier, so this failure was painful for him. He stood by the window and watched the twilight in silence for a long time, but he could only force himself to endure. "Brother Yin Chuan, take care." The shadow of the officer's face was faintly reflected on the glass of the window. He stared at the shadow as if he were staring at the face of the deceased, silently mourning, but he did not take off his military cap. If the gunman had an antimaterial rifle, he might have been able to complete the mission and escape to Bermuda. However, the Federation strictly controlled firearms, and there was no one like Mr. Schur in the circle of officers, so they had no access to the dark waters at the bottom of the Federation. If the gunman had used a long-range sniper rifle, the Federation and the Zhong family in the Westwoods would have investigated a lot of things afterward. Of course, the military officer knew the real reason why the gunman was unwilling to use a sniper rifle. It was not only to protect their collective iron will, but also because, as an outstanding professional soldier, he was unwilling to use a sniper rifle to assassinate a cute little girl. He was unwilling to do such a despicable thing, let alone let the little girl die so cruelly. The military officer quietly looked at himself on the glass. Like the dead gunman, he also thought that assassinating an innocent little girl was a very despicable thing, but for the greater goal, they had to persevere. For the true brilliance of the universe, they could allow a few small black dots to appear in the background. In reality, the power group that the military officer belonged to, just like 2 years ago, still wanted to gain some benefits from this failed assassination mission. The assassination happened in Wood Valley Manor, and the gunman's identity was a security member of the Lin family. No matter what explanation was given after the incident, the relationship between the Westwoods tiger, which was already arrogant among the 7 families, and the other families would probably worsen. Even the anti-government forces from Green Dragon Mountain who were about to enter the front lines of the Westwoods would probably have some problems with the Westwoods military because of today's incident. The military officer used a clear mind to make calculations like a tactical deduction. After confirming that the important person he followed did not miss anything, he sighed softly. 2 years ago, if the young master of the Tai family had really died, how good would that have been? 2 years later, if the little princess of the Zhong family died, the succession of the Zhong family in the Westwoods would be in chaos. The brothers of the tiger would probably rush to adopt all of their sons and daughters. How good would that have been? Unfortunately, both plans had been ruined by that young man named Xu Le. Of course, the most important reason for this plan was that some people could not allow Xu Le to get too close to the Zhong family in the Westwoods. Xu Le was the future that the Federation had deliberately nurtured, while the Zhong family in the Westwoods was an old past that was destined to be erased from history. Linking the two together was not in the Federation's interest. The military officer silently lowered his military cap and walked out of the office. When he left, he had already calmed down. A gunman had tried to assassinate the daughter of Commander Zhong in the Westwoods and was killed on the spot in the Wood Cove Manor. Who among the important people in the Federation government and Parliament Hill did not know the importance of this young daughter to the political situation of the Federation? Countless flames of anger were instantly directed at all the powerful departments. The Federation Investigation Bureau and the Capital Police Bureau started an investigation overnight. With the help of the Bureau of Proclamation, it only took them a short time to find out the true identity of the gunman, but it also stopped the investigation of the mastermind behind the scenes. The gunman's surname was Chen Yinchuan, and his name was Chen Yinchuan. He graduated from the 1st Military Academy and was now the deputy director of the Lin family's security consultant department. However, this person had a sensitive and real identity. He was secretly serving as a military officer in the Ministry of National Defense. In fact, when he graduated from the 1st Military Academy to entering the Lin family as a security consultant, it was all arranged by the federal military. Other than the fact that he had to explain to the Zhong family in the Westwoods, only Xu Le knew the truth of the joint investigation. The Ministry of National Defense asked him to keep it a secret because it involved military secrets and involved the Federation government secretly infiltrating the 7 families. This was a matter of course, but it was still a shocking fact. The 7 families in the Federation were obviously very close to the senior government officials and members of Parliament. However, in private, the Federation government and Parliament Hill were also counteracting the 7 families. The outstanding undercover military officer named Chen Yinchuan was one of these countermeasures. This background seemed a little interesting, but in Xu Le's eyes, it seemed particularly cold. According to the records in the file and his understanding of the federal military training system, he believed that this gunman had excellent abilities and was absolutely loyal to the Federation. But why did he want to kill Little Watermelon? No one knew the real reason why Chen Yinchuan carried out this assassination, and no one could find out who was behind it. The joint investigation team only found out that when Chen Yinchuan was studying at the 1st Military Academy, he was once appreciated by the dean at the time, Yang Jingsong, and the two had a close relationship. And Yang Jingsong was the Deputy Minister of National Defense who had committed suicide in the Ministry of National Defense building because of the assassination in Linhai State. Because of this clue, the investigation concluded that this assassination was a last-ditch counterattack by some young men of the federal military in the context of the Federation's Great Reconciliation. It was a crazy revenge for the Linhai State Gymnasium incident. Based on the current intelligence, this was just an independent incident, and there was not too much of a conspiracy. Xu Le did not agree, and would not accept this conclusion of the investigation. This was because the powerful gunman was clearly not here to kill him, but to target little Watermelon. Chen Yinchuan. He silently looked at the secret information and photos of the gunman in the electronic file. He thought about the 3 shots under the ancient pine on the cliff. He thought about how powerful this person was, and couldn't help but feel a little emotional. The universe was so big, and there were indeed too many hidden outstanding people. Shula had long foreseen Fatty Tian's fierceness, but this unknown officer had unexpectedly shocked him. After destroying the electronic file, he stood up, put on the black formal suit, and walked out of the office in Whitewater Company. As soon as he walked out, he heard Magnolia's soft but exceptionally cold reprimand. "Don't really think of yourselves as mercenaries. You should know that I am the only one in Group 7 who does not have a military record. You are real soldiers, carrying out the orders of the Ministry of National Defense. I can't believe you can be so careless. Even if you are mercenaries, do you want to let the person you are protecting be in danger alone? What's more, you should know that he is our supervisor, our leader. After returning to the military camp for more than a year, all of you have completely forgotten the meaning of killing without batting an eyelid. So when the supervisor was pointed at by a gun, none of you thought that he would die. Is that why none of you were by his side?" Magnolia smiled slightly, but her smile was incomparably sarcastic. "I know that our supervisor is very strong, stronger than any of you, but no matter how strong he is only one person, and you. Are you going to be his last bulletproof vest, his last dagger? Or are you saying that in the future on the battlefield, you are counting on our supervisor to protect you? Where were you at that time? Do I need all of you to protect that little girl? Do you really expect me to follow him alone? Don't forget that I was just discharged from the hospital." The 18 men of Group 7 stood in the aisle obediently as Magnolia, whose black hair swayed in front of her forehead, mocked and scolded them. Magnolia had a gentle temperament, but the violent members of Group 7 were as obedient as a row of quails in front of her. Of course, Lan Xiaolong, who was shrugging at the moment, was an exception. Because Shula was shot by the gunman in Wood Valley Manor, Magnolia was really in a bad mood. Looking at her former subordinates, she naturally did not have any kind words to say. Although she still spoke softly, there was an indescribable coldness. Shu Le, who walked out of the door, narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at Magnolia's back for a moment. After a moment of silence, he opened his mouth and interrupted her scolding. "Prepare the car, we are going to accept the mission." Magnolia's body trembled slightly, and then she slowly raised her head and said softly, "Yes." A few minutes later, the dark green paramilitary motorcade drove out of the Whitewater Company base and along the ring highway of the capital, Special City, came to a quiet group of villas in the southern suburbs. The people who lived in these villas were all rich and powerful, and this did not exceed the expectations of the members of Group 7 regarding the residence of the national idol girl. The most popular idol girl in the universe had been away from the public eye of the Federation for as long as a year. Thinking that they would be responsible for her safety in the future, even these ruthless people who used to kill and set fire at the edge of the universe all year round couldn't help but feel a little expectant and curious. However, this group of ruthless people was stopped in front of the villa with a courtyard. Chapter 374. In fact, the villas of Autumn Mountain were not grouped together. Among the Golden Mountains that were no more than 200 meters high, more than 10 villas of different styles were scattered in the valley. This scattered design fully preserved the privacy of the villa owners. Even if they had lived together for 3 or 4 years, perhaps the villa owners had never seen each other. Although the low mountains around the villa were not high, they were just enough to satisfy the desire of the upper-class celebrities of the Federation to see the mountains when they went out, but they did not want to climb the mountains and sweat. In addition, the valley was covered by red leaves, and when they turned around, there was an old wooden house with a yellowish hue looming in the grass beside the road. It was indescribably noble and quiet. The 18 men of Whitewater Company's Team 7 looked at the beautiful scenery around them and the villa in front of them. Although their faces were still cold and calm, their hearts were already filled with endless curiosity. The idol girl of the Federation seemed to be in her 20s this year, but she could actually live in such a noble place. Under the direct order of Whitewater Security Company's headquarters, Team 7 led by Shula would officially take over the work of Jian Shuai's security consultant, or the so-called bodyguard, from today onwards. However, when they came to the villa of Autumn Mountain, they were neatly blocked by a group of colleagues. The people of Team 7 were not angry after being fooled. They just looked indifferently at the black-clothed colleagues inside and outside the villa, waiting for their superiors to negotiate with the head of security at the door. Although these men were very curious about and liked Jian Shuai, after all, they were a group of ruthless people who often did dirty things for the Federation. They always felt conflicted when the company, or the Ministry of Defense, directly forced them to be bodyguards. At the gate of the villa of Autumn Mountain, a head of security about 40 years old calmly looked at the motorcade at the gate. His eyebrows trembled slightly, and then returned to normal. A motorcade of 7 military vehicles painted dark green, but there was no military license plate. There was something strange about this matter. We are now responsible for protecting the villa of Autumn Mountain. The head of security said with a smile, I didn't know that Miss Jian Shuai had other arrangements. Lan Xiaolong, who was in charge of negotiations, shrugged. He was not used to the tight work attire of Whitewater Company. I don't know why you are here, but we have signed a contract with the people in the villa. Today is the first day of work. Regardless of whether there is a misunderstanding or not, I think you should let us in. Sorry, this is my duty. Without the permission of the villa owner, no one is allowed to enter. The head of security's tone was very polite, but there was an unquestionable certainty in it. He looked at the 7 dark green military vehicles in front of the villa and thought of something that his young master had vaguely mentioned before. He asked, Are you from the same military region? Lan Xiaolong was slightly taken aback. He used to be from the 83-84 military region, but now he was a bodyguard for the Whitewater Company. He tugged at his sleeves, lowered his head and shrugged. No, we're from the Whitewater Company. When the head of security heard them admit that they were not from the same military region, his mood became calmer. He smiled and said, So you are Bai Shuai's colleagues. Sorry, I still can't let you in, and I haven't seen your contract. But since yesterday, we have taken over the work of the security consultant of Autumn Mountain. As for the Whitewater Company, my superior will greet your company's president. His words were full of toughness. He knew that the people outside the villa belonged to the Whitewater Company, but this head of security was still so tough. Obviously, the background of the security department that had been stationed in the villa of Autumn Mountain was not smaller than that of Nutshell behind Whitewater. The head of security's words were not provocative, but there was a hint of condescension. However, what surprised him was that the bodyguards of the Whitewater Company at the gate did not respond at all. Some smoked, and some continued to close their eyes to rest. I think you should ask for permission first. Shu Le, who had been smoking silently beside the car, suddenly said. The head of security glanced at Shu Le and said slowly, I don't think it's necessary. This sentence was said lightly. Shu Le suddenly thought of the scene on the terrace of the Flowing Wind Slope Club and smiled. He didn't care who these people were, and he didn't want to waste time on these small conflicts. He directly took out his phone and dialed a string of numbers. He said into the phone, We are here, but we are blocked. Can you come out and pick us up? I know she is taking a nap, but I still want to persuade her not to go to the West Woods. The war there is about to start, especially when she stubbornly put the concert on the planet 5460. You have to know that the small planet is still a dangerous area where the two sides are fighting each other. No one knows when the Federation will launch a counterattack, and if they will launch a counterattack. Inside the villa on Choming Mountain, the first successor of the Li family, the vice president of the Sanlin United Bank, Li Xiuzhu, flashed a slightly bitter smile on his extremely handsome face. I know what she is thinking, but it is not necessary after all. Sister Tong looked at the calm and gentle young master of the Li family in front of her and couldn't help but feel a little apologetic. She had a very good impression of this young master of the Li family. She replied awkwardly, You also know that even the family can't stop the young miss from making a decision. It is useless for me to persuade her. Li Xiuzhu was slightly silent. He knew Jian Shuai's secret background, so he had never treated her as a star. In the eyes of the 7 great families, any dazzling star was no different from an ornament that would come and go as she pleased. However, Jian Shuai was not that kind of person. Li Xiuzhu had to admit that he had been deeply attracted to this girl who was much younger than him during the 2 years they had spent together. That was why when he found out that the other party had decided to travel to the faraway celestial forest, his usually apathetic heart was filled with worry and sorrow. If she insists, then please bring the security personnel outside. Li Xiuzhu raised his head and showed a gentle smile on his face. He looked at Sister Tong and said, "It is not that I don't respect you, but the stars are far away, and she has always been unwilling to rely on the power of the family. She always needs more security forces around her to be at ease." Li Xiuzhu, who was the assistant and bodyguard of Jian Shuai, who looked gentle but was extremely proud, could also say the word you. It only showed that he was determined to get that girl and couldn't forget her. Li Xiuzhu smiled slightly and reached out to stop Sister Tong's refusal. He said, "They are all the elite forces of the family, all from the special forces of the major military regions, and they have been through a long time of training. In terms of fighting power and professional quality, I believe that they are more trustworthy than the 3 major security companies. I will reject the contract with the Whitewater Company," Li Xiuzhu said lightly. However, at this moment, the phone in Sister Tong's hand rang. Sister Tong apologized and hurriedly walked out of the villa. Li Xiuzhu looked at Sister Tong's back quietly. He didn't think about the content of the phone call. He only thought about the girl who was taking a nap upstairs. Until today, he only knew that the national girl who made the entire Federation obsessed should be a member of that family, and the kind that was very close. However, he still didn't know what the specific relationship was. Sister Tong walked out of the villa and saw the security personnel of the Li family and the 7 groups of men confronting each other. She nodded to the head of security and walked straight to Shu Le. She said apologetically, "I am really sorry. They are the security personnel sent by a friend of the Miss." The 2 sides didn't communicate well. Shu Le put the cigarette under his foot and put it out. Then, he straightened up and smiled at Sister Tong. "It's nothing. I just want to ask, when can my people take over? This may need to be communicated." Sister Tong looked at Shu Le in front of her and said softly, "If the 2 sides are jointly responsible for the security work, what do you think?" Shu Le was slightly stunned and didn't speak. He let the silence ferment for a long time in front of the villa. Then, he said, "It seems that the friend of Miss Jian Shuai has a lot of influence on you." Sister Tong frowned slightly. She was not used to the tone of this sentence. She knew very well that the young man in front of her had done a lot of things in the past 2 years. However, when they met again today, she was shocked to find that Shu Le's temperament seemed to be very different from before. However, when she heard the hidden criticism and faint warning in Shu Le's words, she still couldn't help but feel slightly embarrassed and angry. "I know that with your current status, it is indeed a waste for you to be the young lady's bodyguard. However, you should always remember that we are the employer," she said with furrowed brows. "I think you have probably forgotten who the real employer is." Shu Le shook his head and said, "I am carrying out the military orders of the Ministry of National Defense." His tone was very calm. There was no hint of anger in it. However, when it fell into Sister Tong's ears, it was not relaxed. As Jian Shuai's personal assistant, of course she knew that the real employer of Shu Le and Team 7 was the Ministry of National Defense. It should even be that old man. Her expression suddenly froze. "If you don't trust the combat power of Team 7, we can leave immediately. However, I need you to help me explain the situation in the ministry," Shu Le said. "Other than that, there is no other cooperation." Shu Le's guess was correct. Sister Tong admired the Li Xiuzhu in the building. That was why she tried to have both sides be responsible for the security work. As an assistant, this kind of attempt was undoubtedly a bit muddle-headed. Fortunately, this attempt was directly rejected by Shu Le. Only now did Sister Tong remember another rumor about the young man in front of her. It was very strange. Because of that rumor, Sister Tong immediately completely forgot about Li Xiuzhu's influence on her. She said apologetically with slight embarrassment, You are right. This is my mistake. The head of security of the Lee family looked at this scene in shock. He didn't know who the head of Team 7 from the Whitewater Company was. He could actually make Sister Tong, who had always been as cold as ice, immediately change her mind. Shula stood back beside the military vehicle and lit another cigarette. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the Choming Mountain Villa in the distance. On the other side, the armed members of Team 7 had already entered the villa under the lead of Sister Tong. They completely ignored the vigilant and hostile gazes in the courtyard. Their faces were cold. Although they could not be said to be valiant and high-spirited, that kind of solemn and indifferent manner still made the security personnel of the Lee family feel an unprecedented provocation and humiliation. Chapter 375. Under the silent agreement of Sister Tong and the staff inside the villa, the Lee family's security personnel had no choice but to leave the villa. The staff of Whitewater Company's Team 7 were not sloppy in their work. They would not give the other party the slightest bit of face. The door opened, and 7 dark green military vehicles drove in. More than 40 Lee family's security personnel stationed in the villa were driven out. Xiong Lingquan, confirm the shooting angle. Install the echo profiler. Jiyu Shifeng, connect the central control system. Encrypt the relevant data channels. Liu Jiao, check the relevant defenses and traffic in the garage. Lu Qin, install the hotstart detector. Following by Yulon's orders in a soft voice, the members of Team 7 who had entered the villa began to get busy. They moved all kinds of professional equipment from the military vehicles and unceremoniously dismantled the security equipment prepared by the Lee family security personnel last night. They carried out connection tests. In the shortest amount of time, they turned this small villa into a fortress filled with countless monitoring systems and firepower systems. The Lee family's security personnel who had been driven out of the villa in a sorry state were originally filled with infinite anger and humiliation. At this time, when they saw the silent and concise movements of Team 7 and the clear and accurate layers of defense, they fell into silence. This was because they saw that the other party's expertise was better than theirs. This was especially so when they saw the equipment that the other party had installed on the walls around the villa and in the garage. In addition to the silence, there was a lot of shock in their eyes. None of them were rookies. Of course, they could tell that a large part of the equipment used by the bodyguards from Whitewater Company was actually used by the military. It was cutting-edge equipment that had not been sold to the civilian market. Where did these people come from? The Lee family's head of security stood outside the villa and watched this scene with a livid expression. He and his subordinates were driven out of the villa together. The shame and anger in his heart could not be any greater. However, with his professional knowledge and experience, he quickly judged that even the top security consulting department of Whitewater Company could not have such perfect mobility and cutting-edge equipment. After completing the initial security measures in the Choming Mountain Villa, Shula took out the pair of sunglasses that he often used in the training base from his left breast pocket. After carefully wiping the lenses, he put them on the bridge of his nose. After entering the villa, he turned around and pressed the electric button to close the door. Through the slowly closing iron door, Shula looked at the security director with a complicated expression. He nodded and said, "Sorry. Team 7 was a combat team. On the vast mineral star and the desolate border of the Westwoods frontline, they had done countless shady public and private jobs. They had killed people, smuggled goods, and committed crimes. No matter what kind of trump card they were in their respective troops, once they were under the name of Team 7, they began to exude a cold and valiant aura. They had never been bodyguards, but they had assassinated countless big shots at the edge of the universe. They were no strangers to security control. On the contrary, they were very familiar with the combat style of the killers and mercenaries. The initial security measures in the Choming Mountain Villa were done flawlessly. All kinds of electronic monitoring equipment were connected, and all kinds of fire control equipment were on standby. By Magnolia, who was as gentle as a virgin, put her hands in her trouser pockets and walked slowly around the villa. Occasionally, she would whisper a sentence, and her subordinates would begin to seriously redesign the relevant links. Impregnable as a fortress, this was what it meant. Xu Le stood under the parasol under the villa with a cigarette in his mouth. He looked at his subordinates who were busy not far away and did not say a word. In this regard, he was not an expert, but he absolutely fully respected and believed in the abilities of his subordinates. However, looking at By Magnolia's back, he could not help but feel a little emotional. People who worked hard to climb up the social ladder generally had to build their own team. The old man in Philadelphia, the federal military, and specifically the Department of National Defense, sent these outstanding soldiers of Team 7 to help him build his own team. However, he never intended to subdue this group of unruly people and build his own team. He had been influenced by that uncle for too long, and he always felt that it was more suitable to wander the stars alone. He did not seek to obtain unparalleled achievements or seize unparalleled power, so why would he need a team? What's more, the scene in front of him had already proven that By Magnolia was the soul of Team 7. This delicate man wanted to lead Team 7 to follow behind Xu Le, so naturally, he hoped that the men of Team 7 could have a good home. Whether they lived or died, at least they had to leave some reputation in the brilliant universe. However, why was Little White so sure that he could bring these things to Team 7? Xu Le looked at By Magnolia's slightly thin back and fell into deep thought. By stabbing him in the back, he might be able to end the grudge between them. However, the reason why he accepted this person back to his side and played such an important role was because of Donglin Shi's bad nature. He wanted to gamble on his own judgment. In his life, he rarely made mistakes in judging people, including Tai Jiyuan and Shi Qinghai. He wanted to know if he would make the same mistake again this time. The secondary security of the villa at Autumn Cry Mountain had been set up. Xu Le looked at the delicate man walking towards him and suddenly understood why many people thought that Secretary Bai was like a woman. It was because By Magnolia always looked down and stared at the area below the throat. He gently moved his eyes, as if he was rotating the delicate knife between his fingers. Don't worry about the debt at the back of the mountain. Have you paid it all? Xu Le asked Magnolia under the parasol in front of the villa. Out of the blue, Magnolia was standing in front of him. By Magnolia's body slightly stiffened, then he nodded and said softly, "Yes. That's good." Xu Le said that Xu Le didn't care who the security personnel chased out of the villa at Autumn Cry Mountain belonged to, because he was carrying out a military order from the Ministry of National Defense. This military order was secretly pushed by the old man in Philadelphia. Although he still didn't fully understand why the old man didn't let him go to the front line of the Westwoods, but instead sent him to be a bodyguard. What kind of unfathomable thoughts did the old man have in mind? However, this didn't prevent him from carrying out this slightly ridiculous mission. Just like what he said to the purple-haired national girl 2 years ago in the Sunshine Ward of the 1st Military Region General Hospital, he always believed that he owed her a life for the assassination at the Linhai State Gymnasium. He didn't care who the security personnel were, but when Xu Le saw the man coming out of the villa, he couldn't help but frown. He subconsciously leaned against the back wall and didn't want to see the man face to face. The wide black sunglasses covered most of his expression. By Magnolia and Lan Xiaolong next to him didn't know what he was thinking. They looked at the man in a light brown linen suit and thought that this person was really handsome and made people feel ashamed of their inferiority. Xu Le and the heir of the Li family had met twice. Not only did they not have any friendship, but there were many lingering shadows and blood between them. Today, he was carrying out official business. Although he was surprised that Jian Shui'er's friend was Li Xiuzhu, he didn't want to have any dealings with this person. The shadow of the villa covered his body. Li Xiuzhu walked out of the villa and saw the unfamiliar faces in the garden. He then looked at his security personnel outside the iron gate and couldn't help but frown. Then, he turned around and looked at him in the shadow. If I knew that you would be in charge of Shue'er's safety, I wouldn't have to do so much. Li Xiuzhu walked in front of Xu Le, smiled gently, and extended his hand. Xu Le understood why the other person walked in front of him. After a slight pause, he held the other person's hand and said, "I'm just carrying out orders." Li Xiuzhu looked at the face in front of him that was deeply engraved in his memory. He suddenly thought of the rumor about Xu Le and the Lis of Philadelphia. There seemed to be a shadow floating in his heart. He slightly frowned and said, "Then I'll leave Shue's safety to you." "You're welcome." Shula let go of his hand. Li Xiuzhu looked at him silently and then suddenly said, "The matters of the human world are often very mysterious. In the things or worlds I care about, I can always see your shadow. I only hope that this time, you won't get in my way." From the bottom of his heart, the Li family's eldest young master didn't want to show any enmity towards the present Shula. It was because he knew better than many people in the Federation what Shula's name meant to the current federal military. However, there was a shadow and a trace of bad omen in his heart. The most important thing was his love for that purple-haired girl, so he couldn't help but add this line. Shula didn't know the true relationship between the Li family's eldest young master and that national idol girl. A faint feeling of frustration surged into his heart, making him not want to say anything more. However, Lan Xiaolong, who was always unwilling to be left out, he didn't know Li Xiuzhu's identity. He said with slight mockery on the side, "Our manager Shu is destined to be a jinx. It will probably be difficult for him to do anything in this life, but if he wants to get in his way, it will always be easy." Lan Xiaolong's unintentional words fell into Li Xiuzhu's ears like a clap of thunder, because this was the truth. No matter how deep Li Xiuzhu's mind was, when he thought of all the things that happened in these 2 years, he still couldn't help but slightly change his expression. After a long silence, he looked at Shula and said in an even voice, "I heard Old Seven has a good relationship with you. After this mission is over, if there is a chance, let's sit together." Shula didn't reply, but a trace of worry surged in his heart. The biggest thing that Li Xiuzhu had done in his life was naturally to support Macklin in the presidential election. However, this matter was broken by Shula, and Macklin was even killed by Shula. However, Li Xiuzhu was still able to casually reach out his hand to reconcile with Macklin without any hesitation. In these 2 years, everyone had grown. Shula always thought that Li Xiaotong was much more outstanding than his cousin, but after seeing him today, this judgment began to waver. "Who is that guy? He looks quite like a dog." Lan Xiaolong frowned and looked at Li Xiuzhu, who was boarding the car outside the villa, and asked curiously. "The vice president of the Sanlin United Bank, the successor of the Li family, Li Xiuzhu." Shula replied, and then walked into the villa. Chapter 376. Li Xiuzhu had to leave the villa on Choming Mountain, not because the lady in the villa was taking a nap, not because his people were being chased out of the courtyard, not because he felt that there was a shadow in front of his eyes when he faced Shula. It was because there were indeed many things that needed to be taken care of for a person of his level. The Federation had passed the Financial Integration Act for a long time. Those financial tycoons who were used to sipping vintage wine in the winery while casually making big deals behind the scenes could no longer sit still under the powerful attacks of the Ministry of Finance and the Audit Office. As the heir of the Li family, he naturally would not show up for this kind of thing. Naturally, those tycoons in the eyes of the Federation citizens would go to the Parliament Hill to fight the case, but he also had to take care of business behind the scenes. But no matter what, in Lan Xiaolong's eyes, this legendary descendant of the 7 great families left a bit bleak and lonely when he faced Shula. Shula did not feel anything about Li Xiuzhu's departure. Whether it was the boy who was the gatekeeper in the past or the popular military officer who now had one foot on the Golden Road, he had always been the same when facing these so-called big shots. He had never been timid or angry. He just treated them as ordinary people. This was related to his experience after he escaped from Donglin, such as the Crown Prince and the Little Princess. But more of it was because of the nature of the stone in Donglin. Although he knew that only the barrel of a gun could spurt out wind and clouds, his mind was as firm as a rock. As the most powerful machine, how could he be shocked and affected by external power, wealth, and force? Put out the cigarette. Walking into the villa, a young girl stared at Shula very angrily and said quickly in a low voice, "Oh." Shula used 2 fingers to hold the cigarette butt and looked around for the ashtray, but he could not find the cold porcelain pit that contained the filth. He could not help but look a bit embarrassed. "I'm really sorry." Sister Tong came down from upstairs. Seeing this scene, she could not help but frown. She quickly drove away the waitress who was a bit arrogant because of the lady's tolerance and said to Shu Le with a bitter smile, "The people in the villa are all service staff who have been with the lady for a long time. They are a bit rude." Sister Tong, who had thought a lot of things clearly, even forgot the good intentions of the young master of the Li family. At this moment, facing Shu Le, she was naturally very polite. After all, it was rumored that the young lieutenant colonel in front of her was the target of the old master's efforts. Shu Le held the cigarette in a daze. Thinking of the cool female military officer he met 2 years ago, he did not know how to react for a moment. After a while, he said with a smile, and said, "You don't have to be so polite. After all, I am just a bodyguard." Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a pot of flowers and plants in the villa hall. He quickly put out the cigarette but in the red mud and sighed with satisfaction. He said to Sister Tong, "I need a schedule." Bodyguard? Sister Tong would definitely not think that way. 2 years ago, when she had saved the unconscious Shu Le in the blood-soaked underground parking lot of the Linhai State Gymnasium, she had only thought that this was a young fellow with decent ability, decent luck, and decent courage. However, 2 years later, this young fellow had already become the youngest lieutenant colonel in the Federation, the key designer of the MX Mecha, and a person whom President Parbre greatly appreciated. Most importantly, everyone now knew of the relationship between him and the old master. Such a person, in addition to those security personnel who clearly had shocking combat power outside the villa, had all been sent to be the lady's bodyguard. Perhaps it could not be said to be a waste of resources, but the truth behind the scenes was definitely not so simple. Sister Tong watched as Shu Le snuffed out the cigarette but in the flower pot. Her expression was a little strange. She wanted to say something, but in the end, she did not say anything. With a soft beep, a detailed itinerary designed by a professional was sent to Shu Le's cell phone. There was an extremely conspicuous secret symbol at the beginning. Shu Le lowered his head and looked at it quietly for a long time. Then, somewhat stunned, he raised his head and asked, "Holding a military concert in the West Woods?" "Yes, the specialized spaceship will depart the day after tomorrow. I hope your personnel can be prepared," replied Sister Tong in a low voice. "Okay." Shu Le scratched his head with the phone in his hand. He had just washed his hair last night, so it was refreshing and did not itch. However, his mind was filled with endless doubts. In the end, he still had to go to the Westwoods, just under a different name. But why would the Department of Defense want him to follow that national idol girl to the Westwoods? Shu Le subconsciously raised his head to look at the fragrant wood flooring. He did not see the barefoot purple-haired girl floating over, but his heart was filled with the same doubts as Sister Tong's. That night, most of the combat personnel of Team 7 stayed in the villa at Autumn Cry Mountain. Shu Le was a professional, but he had personally witnessed the delicate and secretive security settings around the villa that made his scalp tingle. While admiring the abilities of his subordinates, he naturally did not have any more worries. During the military exercise in the early hours of the graduation day, the men of Team 7 faced the Defense Battalion of the Iron 7th Division. Unsurprisingly, they were all annihilated. However, that was on a virtual battlefield. When doing such meticulous activities in real society, with the ability displayed by Team 7, today's villa at Autumn Cry Mountain would not be able to be breached even if there was a reinforced company attacking it head-on. After leaving S1, the security plan was naturally handled by Secretary Bai and the other professionals. As the nominal supervisor, he seemed to have nothing to do. After his shift that night, he left the villa at Autumn Cry Mountain and returned to his apartment in Wangju. However, thinking that he did not see the purple-haired girl that he had not seen in a long time, he could not help but feel a little strange. Going to the West Woods to protect the dazzling national girl, and behind him was the shadow of the most extraordinary mountain in the Federation. Everything was in a maze, and he could not see the real future. Shu Le was not relaxed, and he even had a strong urge to call Philadelphia. However, he helplessly discovered that although the Federation was abuzz about his relationship with the Lees of Philadelphia, and it was extremely bizarre, and some people even said that he was the long-lost son of the military god Li Pifu. In fact, he did not even have the old man's phone number. At the front line of the West Woods, A great battle was about to break out. Jian Shuya chose this moment to visit the soldiers at the front line, and the location was still the most dangerous planet. On one hand, Shula admired the courage and perseverance of his dream idol, but on the other hand, he was also endlessly vigilant. Faintly, that obscure and ominous thought of his actually became a little clearer. Would he be able to come back after going to the west this time? It was precisely because of this sudden unfavorable thought that Shula had to say goodbye to the people he cared about. Unfortunately, when he returned to his apartment in Wangju and kept making phone calls, he found that the few friends he had actually expressed their intentions of saying goodbye to him in advance. Shi Qinghai left a piece of paper and then leisurely followed the Green Dragon Mountain Anti-Government Army Unit, now the Federation Special Forces, to the front line of the West Woods yesterday on a military spaceship to assume the position of liaison officer that was proposed by Green Dragon Mountain and personally appointed by President Parbre. Zhu Yu left a few recorded phone calls and then took her child to Linhai Province. As an unmarried mother, she threw herself into the school that had been interrupted for 2 years. Tai Jiyuan had completely disappeared. Although he had vaguely mentioned before leaving that he was going to ease the tension between the tiger in the Westwoods and the Central Federation government, and this was not the first time this person had disappeared, Shula was still a little worried. Shula had already mentally prepared himself for these people to leave, but when he heard Li Wei, who was sitting on the sofa drinking beer, also say that he was leaving S1 soon, he finally couldn't help but scratch his hair in distress. He revealed a mouth full of white teeth and helplessly asked, "Where are you going again?" Li Wei didn't immediately answer his question. Instead, he held the beer bottle and looked at him with a smile, sinking into silence. This former orphan leader looked at the friend he had grown up with and thought silently in his heart. Compared to when he was on Clock Tower Street, Shula had become even more silent. Although his eyes were still smiling, he felt that it was different from before. Time can change a lot of things, but perhaps it can't even change the traces on the beach. Li Wei thought silently. He was caught and brought to Bermuda. Those people were obviously using him to threaten Shula, but this kid, who needed to hide his identity, didn't abandon him. As a youth at the bottom of Donglin's underworld, he had seen countless treachery, deceit, and dark filth in prison. He admitted that if he were in Shula's position, he wouldn't be able to do it. It would be good if he didn't stab the other party with a knife. Donglin is a small place. The sky is always covered with grey dust. You can't see the stars clearly, so naturally, you don't know how big this world is. Li Wei broke the silence and said softly, "This time, I was caught by those big shots. Although it was a lot of trouble, I still went to Bermuda. That's Bermuda we're talking about." Li Wei laughed self-deprecatingly and said with a bit of loneliness and injustice, "You know very well which kid on our street has left Hushi Province. Even the most ferocious gang leader back in the day, which one of them left Donglin? But I did. Who would believe that such a small figure like me actually came to the capital and even left the Federation?" "Then why don't you stay in S1? Shula said. "No, I want to go to Bermuda." Li Wei looked down at the beer bottle and said, "I don't want to see the world of beer for the rest of my life. Yes, S1 is very big and the capital is very prosperous, but I still prefer Bermuda." He looked up, suppressed the emotions in his heart and said quickly, "Bermuda is different from the Federation. The underworld, there is the real underworld. The people there dare to do anything. Who the fuck is like Clock Tower Street, who controls a few black market dealers in a few blocks and thinks that they're fierce just because they stabbed a few people in the stomach? There's no charter there." Li Wei stared seriously into Shula's eyes and said, "I admit that looking at your current brilliance makes me feel uneasy. I want to do something, and I can't follow you for the rest of my life. Life has to be a little challenging. I'm not like you who was born to do great things, but I also want to play a little more exciting." Shula was silent. He unscrewed the bottle cap with his hand and gulped down a few mouthfuls of beer. The white foam at the corner of his mouth mixed with the saliva that Li Wei had spat on his face. Li Wei stared at the beer bottle and said in a low voice, "I can't go back to Donglin because I will always be a problem for you. So I want to go to Bermuda. But don't worry, My goal this time is definitely not to take down a few streets. Shula put down the beer bottle and looked at him silently. He asked, "What do you want to do?" They were friends who grew up together, so they knew each other's temperament and mentality very well. Li Wei was silent for a long time under his gaze. Finally, he spoke his true feelings. "Don't think that you're doing well in the Federation right now. I can see that you have a lot of troubles. Give me some of your current resources and let me go to Bermuda for a few years to make a name for myself. If the Federation wants to deal with you in the future, I really want to leave you a way out outside the Federation." Leave a way out. Shula picked up the beer bottle and drank a few mouthfuls. He coughed and choked until his nose was slightly sore, but his heart was slightly warm. Chapter 377. When people from the same hometown see each other, they might tear up, or they might stab each other in the back. Shula and Li Wei did not hug each other and cry, nor did they have the dark thoughts of stabbing each other in the back to erase their previous lives. They only listened to each other's resolute and powerful words about the path of retreat. Both of them were moved to the point of confusion. "Don't pee." Li Wei took a swig from the beer bottle and sighed. Shula lowered his head and said, "I'm not a person who can be moved easily." Although Shula was moved, there was no way he would agree to let Li Wei leave and go to Bermuda to fight for the underworld that he might never be able to conquer. Now that the front line in the Westwoods was tense, he could not ask the madam of the Zhong family to help him do anything. In the Bermuda starfield, he could not find any resources at all. The underground emperor of Bermuda, Lin Banshan, had only brushed past him on the high-speed rail and had nothing to do with him. Most importantly, Shula believed that he had a path of retreat that no one could think of. Even if the Federation mercilessly abandoned him in the future, he still had the old man in the glory of the Charter to help him. Even if the old man suddenly turned against him, he still had the bracelet on his left hand. No matter how depressing or difficult the situation was, he was confident that he could forcefully carve out a path full of blood. Letting Li Wei take the risk to find a path of retreat outside of the Federation was something he absolutely could not accept, even though it was Li Wei's dream since he was young. Shula was not worried about rejecting Li Wei's departure. He believed that Li Wei only knew him in the capital ring and had no money or connections. It was impossible for him to secretly cross the galaxy and sneak into the distant Bermuda starfield. So the next morning, when he saw the note under the beer bottle on the coffee table, he was so angry that he had the urge to throw the beer bottle out of the window. But in the end, because he didn't want to hit the children or the flowers under the apartment building, he stopped. "You gave him funding, you let him get acquainted with the smugglers in Bermuda. Have you ever thought that he is my friend? You should at least get my permission first." In an open space near the expressway in the southern suburbs of the Capital Special District, Shula stepped on a few pieces of crushed autumn leaves and glared at Li Xiaotong in front of the car. He wished he could beat the cold and gloomy seventh young master into pieces of red plum blossoms dancing in the air. Li Wei quietly left the capital and embarked on an unknown journey to Bermuda because of the sponsorship provided by seventh young master Li. Even the few Bermuda smugglers were able to find an opportunity to establish connections with them because of the luncheon at Wood Valley Manor. He left in a hurry. "I didn't know that you didn't know about this. It wasn't convenient for me to call you last night." Li Xiaotong could feel the anger in Shula's heart at this time and did not dare to be careless. He explained very seriously, "But you can rest assured that I have already talked to those smugglers. Whether it is on the journey or after arriving in Bermuda, they will take good care of Li Wei. In fact, I think that since your friend is so ambitious, you should just let him be. If there is no other way, you can talk to Lin Banshan. Who in Bermuda dares to provoke him?" Seventh young master Li's words were actually foreshadowing. He sponsored Li Wei to go to Bermuda to build up his business. On one hand, he wanted to further invest in Shula and Shula's circle. On the other hand, he also wanted to plant a foreshadowing because he admired a small figure like Li Wei. In Wood Valley Manor, he tried to find out more about Shula's past from this person, but there was no progress. This made him admire Li Wei even more. "I don't know Lin Banshan. Shula looked at Li Xiaotong. He really wanted to throw this friend to the ground and beat him up, although he was the only friend who came to send him off. However, he glanced at Brother Zheng, who was still standing behind 7th young Master Li like an iron spear bound by cloth. In the end, he could only sigh. Logically speaking, Shula's identity as a fugitive from the Federation had been forcibly suppressed by the old man. Lady Tai should not make a move on Li Wei because it was not in line with the interests of the family. However, what if the old man died? Li Wei was a gap in Shula's identity. This time, would the Tai family let the Zhong family of the Westwoods interfere and take over the matter? With the experience of last year, Shula knew that if the worst situation happened again, with Li Wei's fierce temperament, he would not let this happen again. If he found that he could not protect himself, then before he fell into the hands of the other party, this orphan leader would be unusually cold and valiant to end his own life. Friends far away, life and death together, how could he endure? However, no matter how moved he was, or how angry he was, it was useless. Shula stood in the autumn wind at the intersection of the highway. After a moment of silence, he returned to calmness, but his heart was still filled with endless loneliness. At least I should thank you for coming to send me off, he said to Li Xiaotong in front of him. Li Xiaotong straightened his black and gold collar to block the autumn wind. He said with a smile that was not a smile, I am not worried about whether you can come back alive from the front line of the Westwoods. I just hope you can satisfy a humble wish of mine. Shula looked at him with a frown. He did not know what his escorting Jian Shuai to the Westwoods had to do with him. You should know that my big brother is pursuing the national idol girl. Although he has not completely succeeded, he has been slowly making progress. The elders in the family are very optimistic about this. The smile on Li Xiaotong's face gradually disappeared. He said lightly, if he succeeds, I have no hope of inheriting the right. Shula frowned slightly. Although he had seen Li Xiuzhu in the villa of Choming Mountain yesterday and could guess that there seemed to be some relationship between him and Jian Shuai, he still did not understand. Not to mention whether or not he would despise Jian Shuai, who was just a star. How could he put such an important matter as inheriting the right on such a matter? Don't pretend that you don't know anything in front of me. Li Xiaotong looked at Shula's stunned face and thought of the information that he had spent a lot of money to find out. He said in a low voice, the road to the Westwoods is long, and the night is long too. As long as you can break this marriage, I will thank you for the rest of my life. Shula frowned more and more, thinking that he was just a bodyguard. He shook his head and said, I don't understand what you want to say. Do you expect me to steal your brother's sweetheart? I can't use the handsome man trick. For such a handsome and successful man like your brother, Shi Qinghai might be able to do it. In this world, handsome men are not popular anymore. The most popular is quiet and sunny young men. Li Xiaotong looked at him and smiled. He turned and waved goodbye, and got into the luxury car with Brother Zheng. Amidst the swift autumn wind at the highway junction, Shula stared at the car that was driving away into the distance. He spread out his hands in a somewhat perplexed manner. He realized that his trip to Siling seemed to be hiding some very mysterious factor. The problem was that it seemed like a lot of people around him knew about it, but he didn't. And it just so happened that those who knew all thought that he already knew. He didn't want to think about this annoying tongue twister anymore. He got into the black car and silently drove to the villa of Choming Mountain in the southern suburbs. Along the way, he saw the capital's autumn scenery and the clear sky. He was about to leave this planet, and he didn't know when he would come back. Tai Jiyuan left, Mr. Shi left, Li Wei left, and Zhu Yu also left. The time he spent with these friends was always short, but the separation was extremely long. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but feel a little sad. Looking at the wild cotton outside the window shivering in the cold wind and turning into white lines in a flash, Shula thought that if something really happened to him, these people would definitely come back to him immediately. He was born in this world, and it was really satisfying to have friends like these who could eat meat and drink wine, talk about life and dreams, and not talk about price or life and death. A motorcade of 27 vehicles of various colors drove out of the villa of Choming Mountain. In the motorcade, there were heavy-duty trucks that were responsible for loading professional equipment, expensive bulletproof Silver Fox vehicles, several minibuses that were responsible for transporting full-time performers, and 7 military vehicles that were painted dark green. This motorcade drove on the road in the southern suburbs of the capital, looking mighty and imposing. There was also an inconspicuous, gloomy black car that was sandwiched behind the motorcade. Schuler gently pressed the radar system on the motorcade to confirm the movement around him. He quietly looked at the expensive bulletproof Silver Fox not far in front of him and couldn't help but feel a little surprised by the formation of this trip. They were on the way to the military space base. Jian Shui, who disappeared from the public of the Federation for more than a year and a half, was not forgotten by people. This time, the selection of the West Woods for her comeback concert received unanimous praise and strong support from the military. The Ministry of Defense did not hesitate to arrange a special spaceship for this national girls' performance team. Logically speaking, as the head of security of Group 7, Schuler should be sitting in the silver car in front of them at this time to protect Jian Shui. But he didn't choose to do so, because after experiencing the assassination in the stadium, he firmly believed that there was no stronger defense in the world than the black car specially made by the Tai family. "I heard that you are now working in the military. No wonder you have the bad habit of wearing sunglasses." In the back seat of the black car, a young girl looked at the back of Schuler in front of her and said lightly. She was wearing a sports windbreaker with a hood, which was wrapped up very tightly. She had a pair of big sunglasses on the tip of her straight and cute nose, but it didn't look exaggerated. Instead, it made the skin exposed by the sunglasses look more delicate and charming. The most charming national girl in the entire universe, Jian Shui, was not sitting in her own car. Instead, she was sitting alone behind Schuler. She looked at the small-eyed boy that she hadn't seen for more than a year and asked, "Why do you insist on letting me sit in this car?" "Because this car is very strong." Hearing the girl's voice behind him, Schuler felt a little nervous, but he forced himself to be calm and answered, "Just as strong as you." Jian Shui looked in front of her with a complicated expression and said, "To protect me, the Bane, you must be the most powerful person in the military, right?" Chapter 378. The rumor that Jian Shui was a jinx had been around for a long time. It was not known whether it was a conclusion made by some bored people in the Federation or by friends who could not find anything exciting on the internet. All in all, from the assassination in the Linhai Prefecture Gymnasium to the terrorist attack in the Huanshan 4 Prefecture's concert, whenever Jian Shui spoke, countless innocent people would lose their lives. Although the number of times wasn't many, the impact was too great and too vile. Everyone knew that these were all dirty things done by Senator Medellin and had nothing to do with Jian Shui. However, the Federation was too big, and there was no lack of space for rumors to grow. There would always be people who would link the deaths and injuries of innocent people to Jian Shui. Although there were not many, it was like someone throwing a piece of rat feces into a pot of plain porridge. It would not stink, but it would be enough to make one choke. A national idol girl who was popular with hundreds of millions of citizens suddenly had a dark aura around her. This national idol must be under a lot of mental pressure. In the past year and a half, she had disappeared from public view, which was more or less related to these rumors. Schuler knew how to answer. He belonged to another line of people involved, so naturally, he would not believe these nonsense. However, he did not know how to comfort the young idol sitting behind him. Although he had met and talked to her before, and even received her selfless help twice, they were just passers-by after all. Now, he was a bodyguard, and Jian Shui was the object of his protection. The motorcade drove into the Federal Military Space Base. Through the sliding open electrically controlled alloy door, they drove directly onto the tarmac. Looking at the spaceship in the distance that was getting closer and closer, Schuler narrowed his eyes. The dense light spots flashing on the vehicle radar made him feel a little uncomfortable. There were no military flags fluttering in the air, no ceremonies and music, but there was still a sea of people. They were not the TV viewers in the Federation who adored Jian Shui, but the officers and ordinary soldiers in the military base. It wasn't until he saw the dense crowd around the tarmac with his own eyes that Schuler truly felt Jian Shui's influence in the Federation. Back then, no, until now, he had always been Jen Shueya's most ardent fan. But when he saw the excited faces of those officers and soldiers, he still felt that it was somewhat inconceivable. The equipment required for the performance, as well as the 7 sets of security equipment, were delivered to the belly of the spaceship through the load-bearing lift at the back of the spaceship. When all the preparations were done, Shula heard Bai Yulon's confirmation in his earpiece. He turned around and said to Jen Shueya, "You may board the spaceship now." The side door of the black car opened. Under the cover of the wall of people, Jen Shueya, who was wearing a hoodie and full-body sportswear, quietly left the black car like an ordinary girl next door. She came to the bulletproof silver fox car and prepared to board the ship. Shula followed her silently, keeping a distance of about half a meter. Originally, Jen Shueya should have boarded the spaceship through the automatic control belt without anyone noticing. However, to everyone's surprise, this national idol suddenly turned her head and gently lifted the hood of her sportswear, revealing a touch of fresh and bright purple short hair. Standing on the automatic control belt, she turned around and waved at the officers and soldiers in the military base who were looking forward to her arrival. The base, which was supposed to be empty but seemed incomparably lively today, suddenly fell silent. Then, a burst of extremely enthusiastic cheers, applause, cheers, and whistles erupted. These sounds intertwined together, forming a chaotic but pleasing accompaniment. Purple was a very bright and eye-catching color. It was very abrupt. Some scientists had once studied that the color of food that humans could not adapt to was purple. Therefore, this color did not give people a sense of intimacy. There was no star in the universe who dared to dye their hair purple, except for her. Only Jen Shueya herself had that kind of fresh, charming, and lovely youthful aura that was like a new willow by the riverside, could make this purple color the most conspicuous and even the most dazzling embellishment. It was engraved in everyone's heart and could not be forgotten at any time. Shula wore sunglasses and silently looked at the national idol standing on the automatic control belt with a smile on her face. In his heart, he thought of the long paragraph of somewhat complicated words in front of him. Although this clearly violated the provisions of the safety control manual, he could not and did not want to stop this national idol from doing this slightly crazy thing. Because Jen Shueya, who was standing on the automatic control belt, was facing the wind and gently waving her hand. Because the touch of purple in the autumn wind was moving, because the pair of calves exposed outside the sportswear was seductive, because he had been incomparably fond and even infatuated with her since he was very young. Although this touch of purple was not on the TV screen but in front of his eyes, the feeling was still the same and had not faded. This time, Jen Shueya went to the front line of the West Woods to hold a concert called Victory. The main purpose was naturally to comfort those brave soldiers who had bravely resisted the invasion of the Empire but had not returned home for a long time. Many famous artists in the Federation had done this kind of gesture of appreciation for the military, but it was the first time that a big star like Jen Shueya had personally gone. In fact, the Federation media, the Performing Arts Association, and those famous stars in their respective fields, had long admitted that the stars in this universe had always been divided into 2 classes. One class was Jen Shueya, and the rest were the rest. This was a strange flower created by the love of the Federation's citizens and the legendary history. No one could deny this. The Ministry of National Defense of course welcomed this kind of thing with both hands. Moreover, the planet Jen Shueya was still in a tug-of-war between the Federation and the Empire. It was an absolutely dangerous fire zone. In addition to the welcome, the federal military was also infinitely grateful. The spaceship that the preparation team of the Victory concert took belonged to the first-class military spaceship of the Federal Fleet. It did not need to go through the old moon base or space station for conversion or mending. It directly broke through the atmosphere and the gravitational force of S1. Under the gaze of countless pairs of eyes and cameras, it left a trail of fog that gradually disappeared before people's eyes. It flew into the vast universe that was sometimes blue and sometimes dark. The spaceship was like a ghost, quietly breaking through the barriers of space and gliding into the distance between the stars in the sky. In fact, all spacecrafts could give the audience a ghostly feeling if they were lucky enough to witness them. Shula was no longer the orphan who could not step out of the bell tower street. He had lost most of his interest in this silent voyage. He only felt that it was boring. He stood silently outside a cabin door, narrowed his eyes and watched the movements around him. He silently calculated the time it would take to reach the West Woods. The military spaceship that belonged to the Federal Fleet was not luxurious, but the Ministry of National Defense still tried its best to provide convenience to the Victory concert team. This was the second floor of the spaceship. Except for the upper floor of the spaceship control hall, it was the safest and most core area. The armed personnel of Group 7 had been distributed to all the key areas, and together with the control officer on the spaceship, they carried out dual control. Jian Shuai's team of as many as 80 people lived on the lower floor. Only a few people had the authority to enter the core area of this floor. Shula was undoubtedly one of them. Although he was lightly ridiculed by the national idol girl in the car, he still wore the pair of sunglasses that he brought back from the base. He looked at the glimmering stars outside the porthole with a blank expression. No one knew what he was thinking. Suddenly, the phone in his arms rang. He picked up the phone and heard the clear voice of Little Watermelon. "Brother Shula, I heard that you are going to the West Woods." "Yes, I am on the spaceship now." On the other end of the phone, Little Watermelon did not show much emotion. She just muttered in a childish tone, "I haven't been back to my hometown for a long time. Brother Shula, when you reach the West Woods, remember to go to number 36, Latitude 2 District. That is my home. I have a little white rabbit. I don't know if it has gained weight now. Help me say hello to it." Listening to this cute request, Shula smiled and agreed. He then said a few words and hung up the phone. Just as he hung up the phone, the heavy alloy cabin door behind him suddenly opened from the inside. A faint blue light flashed through the surface of his sunglasses. He slowly narrowed his eyes and looked at the purple-haired girl by the floor-to-ceiling window in the cabin. The national idol bathed in the starlight, and he suddenly remembered the first time he saw Little Watermelon on the ancient bell 3 years ago. Sister Tong walked out of the cabin with a melancholy expression. When she saw Shula standing outside the door, she was slightly startled. She bowed her head to signal him and turned to leave. She did not seem to care that Shula was interacting with her. "Miss, come in. I have something to ask you." The purple-haired girl in the cabin did not look back. She seemed to know that someone was standing outside the door and said softly. Shula was slightly startled. He did not know if this sentence was directed at him. After hesitating for a moment, he finally walked in. The heavy alloy door slowly closed behind him. Jian Shuai, who was in a private safe space, was not like the national idol that people imagined or saw on TV. At least, she was not dressed like that. She had already taken off the girl next door's full-body sports coat. In the warm environment of the spaceship, she wore a knitted hemp shirt. The fabric was very loose and casual, covering the young girl's body, but it couldn't cover her bare legs and the pair of soft white cotton socks on her feet. She had been kneeling on the chair, holding her chin and quietly looking at the stars outside the floor-to-ceiling window. The faint silver light of the stars shone through the window, gently caressing her hair, clothes, and every curve of her youthful body. It was like a moonlight halo. Shula silently walked 3 meters behind her and stopped. The scene in front of him was like an oil painting. The girl was the protagonist in the oil painting. Although she did not deliberately charm anyone, she was destined to charm the world. For him, the visual impact of this close distance made him not dare to take another step forward. The national idol in the starlight slowly turned around after a long silence. She looked at Shula seriously and slightly angrily said, Chapter 379. The fashion emperor of the Federation, the absolute dominator of Hong Kong's perfume-filled streets, Mr. Lanford, had once expressed to the media indignantly that it was fortunate that Jian Shuai only wore her student uniform or the dark blue Federal Fleet female officer uniform on TV. Based on her usual fashion sense, she should definitely be thrown into a space garbage disposal pod, never to be seen by anyone. But on the day of his speech, Mr. Lanford personally called the reporters and sent them red wine, sincerely requesting that his speech not be published in the newspapers. This was because he began to regret it when he woke up. Aside from some unspeakable pressure, this fashion emperor had to admit that he greatly admired Jen Shueya's straightforward personality and infinite charm on TV. Most importantly, even if the national idol wore bright red bloomers and a green double-curtain tight skirt, as long as her flawless beautiful face and that head of slightly fluffy purple hair were not covered, it was enough to attract anyone's attention. She was born with a clear face, so why did she need the so-called fashion sense to carve it? Shula never read fashion magazines, so he did not know that the Federation's fashion circle hated this national idol for her incompetence, sighed helplessly at her natural gemstone-like brilliance, and felt deeply moved. But when he saw the girl under the starlight looking back, he suddenly had the same feeling. The girl's nose was straight, her lips were soft, her eyes were bright, and her eyelashes were long and thin. When she blinked, it was as if she wanted to soften everyone's heart. Although she was already in her 20s and was no longer the pure and innocent little girl who made thousands of uncles crazy when she first appeared on Channel 23, she had just entered the most charming stage of a young girl. Her body was wrapped in a coarse-woven hemp garment, and her tender, white, round legs were exposed, exuding a heart-stopping beauty. Beauty was everywhere and not rare, but every description of every detail, every kind of praise, when it came to this girl, was close to a miracle. Not to mention, her head of purple hair was soft when it should be, and vigorous when it should be. The expression on her moving face was innocent when it should be, and angry when it should be. Every little curve of her wrinkled face was so soul-stirring. As the saying goes, appropriate anger, appropriate joy, appropriate light makeup, appropriate heavy makeup, it was probably referring to her. This was a person who possessed all the spirit of creation and made people feel close to her. She should only appear in the imagination of humans or in cartoons drawn based on their imagination, but she appeared on the screen at the age of 12 and caused countless waves in the Federation. In the boring life of the Eastwoods region, Jen Shueya was the greatest spiritual sustenance for all the unemployed miners and orphans. Their feelings for her were much deeper than those of the average citizen of the Federation. Shula had clearly come into contact with her more than a year ago, but when he saw this scene, he saw the girl in the starlight looking back at him indifferently, with a trace of anger in her eyes, and a circle of extremely cute wrinkles on her brows. His heart buzzed, crushed by some kind of numbness, as if it was going to stop beating. He was completely unable to react. In front of the girl in the oil painting, even the thickest nerves would short-circuit. In front of this girl in the oil painting, even the most powerful first-order machine would stop operating in front of such a faint gaze. After 7 seconds of silence, Shula's mind suddenly recalled what Jen Shueya had said. His heart, which was about to return to normal, once again exploded. Blind date. When Shula encountered a critical moment, he always habitually narrowed his eyes, letting his eyes shine, and then said some dirty words. But today, he suddenly encountered a great stimulation, which was very different from his usual interest. Even his voice was so sharp that it changed a little bit. He opened his eyes wide and looked at the girl in the chair 3 meters away in disbelief. His tongue was stiff as if it had been electrocuted, and he shouted vaguely, "Fuck. What?" Jen Shueya obviously did not regard herself as the so-called leader of the Jade Girls sect. Her hands tightly grasped the back of the rotating chair, and she stared at Shula without showing any weakness. She angrily puffed up her pink cheeks, knitted her eyebrows and repeated, "Blind date." Shula took off the sunglasses on the bridge of his nose with the fastest speed, and rubbed his eyebrows hard to make sure that he was not in the wonderful dark dream that the old woman had woven. The big star in front of him would not be so bored as to use this kind of thing to tease him. Standing in the same place, he only felt that his scalp was numb, and he did not know what was going on at all. "You don't know?" Jen Shueya slightly lowered her head to look at him, trying to nail Shula to the wall with 2 vicious eyes. However, her eyelashes were too long, and her eyes were too bright and soft. Although she was not shy when she lowered her head, she looked more cute. "I don't know." Shula felt that his lips were a little dry. He stared blankly at the girl in the chair close to him, licked his lips, and innocently said, "I don't even know what you are talking about." It was quiet in the main cabin of the spaceship. The oil paintings hanging on the walls were all of the previous commanders of the Federal Fleet. They were smiling gently with them, and quietly looking at the silent young man and woman in the cabin. After a long silence, Jen Shueya suddenly smiled. A trace of cunning flashed through her eyes under the fluffy purple hair, and said, "I'm just teasing you. You are really interesting. You are already a lieutenant colonel, but you still fall for this kind of trick." Ah! Shula stared at her blankly. It took him a long time to react, but his mind was still in shock. His only idol would also make such a boring and somewhat embarrassing joke. He seriously looked at Jen Shueya for a long time, but he did not find a trace of reluctance and concealment between the girl's eyebrows. He somewhat helplessly shook his head, scratched his head, put on the sunglasses again, and turned around to walk out of the cabin door. Seeing the small-eyed boy walk out of the room, the cunning and teasing expression in Jen Shueya's eyes instantly disappeared and was replaced by a strong sense of embarrassment. She quietly squatted on the chair like a young girl's plaster statue, and then jumped to the ground without warning. She desperately rubbed her fluffy purple hair in distress, and quickly walked around the big soft bed, muttering non-stop, "Embarrassing, embarrassing. I've completely embarrassed myself." The more she thought about it, the more embarrassed she felt. Her beautiful face was full of a slight blush of shame. She jumped on the bed, buried her face in the pillow, and murmured something. After a long time, she turned around, tidied up the messy hair on her cheeks, and seriously stared at the mirror on the ceiling. Looking at the cute but embarrassed girl in the mirror, she clenched her small fists and said very seriously, "Jen Shueya, you are the best professional actress. He will definitely be fooled by you." "Miss, who are you trying to fool?" Outside the room, Sister Tong found that Shula's expression was very strange when he left. She didn't understand what happened between the two in the room, so she curiously walked in and just happened to hear Jen Shueya's words of encouragement for her. Jen Shueya found that the person who walked in was her, so she buried her face in the pillow again and said vaguely, "It's all your fault." "What blind date? That guy obviously doesn't know anything. If I let him think that I'm crazy, how can I face people? He doesn't know." Sister Tong looked at the girl on the bed in disbelief and covered her mouth. "I told you it was impossible." Jen Shueya sat up straight in anger. She glanced at her and said, "I don't know where you got the news from. I don't even know myself, but you insist that he's here for a blind date with me." Sister Tong walked to the bed and sat down, saying, "Miss, I also went home last time and spent a lot of effort to get the dean to open his mouth. It shouldn't be wrong, right? When has the old Taoist ever told the truth?" Jen Shueya shook her head dejectedly and said, "It didn't happen in the first place, and now I have to pretend to be some independent girl. How laughable. Probably only in front of Sister Tong would this national girl, who was doted on by millions of people, show such a delicate side." Even though Sister Tong had seen this side of her many times, she still couldn't help but smile. She put an arm around her shoulder and said, "Shula was able to defeat that little lunatic on Khaki Peak, and is also a key figure in the MX Mecha. What's even more frightening is that during the last military exercise, I heard that even Du Shaoqing was defeated by him. A person like this, why do you think the Department of Defense didn't send him to the front lines of the Westwoods to fight, but instead sent him here to be your bodyguard, miss?" Jen Shueya rubbed the tip of her nose, bit her lower lip and said hatefully, "Maybe it's because everyone thinks that I'm a jinx, so they can lure some people out and then let him kill them for military merit." "Nonsense," said Sister Tong helplessly. "Last time, after the first young master of the Li family married you, that old Taoist you were talking about really liked him. But for some reason, that madam kept stirring up trouble, which is why the family didn't speed up the pace." When she mentioned that madam, Sister Tong's eyes clearly showed disapproval and even anger. Jen Shueya tugged at her clothes and said with her head lowered, "If you like that bamboo that's soft on the outside and hollow on the inside, then marry him yourself." "The first young master of the Li family is not as bad as you say," said Sister Tong helplessly. "If that bamboo is so good, then why were you so polite to that small-eyed lieutenant colonel?" asked Jen Shueya with wide eyes. Sister Tong glanced at the deep starry sky outside the floor-to-ceiling window and laughed softly. "This one was personally chosen by that person, so of course he's not bad. Didn't they say that he's the illegitimate son of the old man?" Jian Shuya sighed and said, then if I'm with him, wouldn't it be like the thunderstorm in Schiller's novel? Sister Tong spat in annoyance and said, of course you and I know that those are all rumors. Speaking of which, it's normal for Schuyler to know that this is a blind date. Ever since that meal at the 1st Military Region's residential area, everyone in the family knows that you hate blind dates. This time, he must have chosen a different path. Maybe he wants you two to try to interact more. Don't say any more. Jian Shuya rolled her eyes and put her hand across her chest to make a pause gesture. She pouted and said, it doesn't matter if the news you heard is true or not. Since that guy doesn't know, then we'll just pretend that we don't know anything. The girl patted her supple chest and said with fear in her eyes, luckily, I've been in the art circle for so many years. At least I have some good acting skills. Sister Tong was helpless. She looked at Jian Shuya with pity, thinking that even Lieutenant Colonel Schuyler wouldn't believe such a ridiculous thing. However, this young couple didn't think about it carefully. With how much the military valued Schuyler, why would they let him be the bodyguard of the nation's girl? This was a long journey to the West Woods. A single man and a single woman were together day and night. Outside the spaceship, there was a slight breeze and dew on the floor-to-ceiling window. It wasn't a blind date, but it was better than a blind date. Chapter 380. Schuyler walked out of the room with his head lowered. He gave instructions to the members of Team 7 who were guarding the exit. He then left the core area through the spaceship's quiet tunnel and went straight to the lower level of the spaceship. This was the newest second-level spaceship of the Federal Fleet. Because it had not yet entered the battlefield, although this was not its maiden voyage, it still had not been officially named. The interior of the spaceship was extremely spacious, but the living quarters occupied a limited amount of space. Schuyler circled the gangway 3 times before he reached the bottom. Stepping on the hard composite floor, he tried his best to take a deep breath before he walked forward. There were quite a lot of people in the resting area. Other than the members who were on a mission, the rest of Team 7 were drinking and watching TV, killing the boredom of the long journey. The officers on the spaceship who were on duty, as well as the engineers and staff of the Victory Concert Performance Team, were also gathered here. Although the voices of the people were not loud, it was still lively. As he walked through the lively crowd, Schuyler deliberately forced a calm expression on his face. It was very unnatural. The others did not notice the difference, but Bai Yulon was the first to react. She stared at Schuyler, who was frowning and forcing a smile, but his eyes were somewhat wandering. She was very surprised. She thought to herself, you didn't lose your composure like this when you went to kill Macklin alone. You were just upstairs watching the door for a while. How did you end up like this? Bai Yulon signaled Xiong Lingquan with her eyes. The two of them quietly put down the teacups in their hands and followed behind Schuyler. Schuyler waved his hand and shook his head tiredly, indicating that he was fine and did not need anyone to follow him. Bai Yulon had no choice but to stop and look at Schuyler, who was completely different from usual. Just like that, they walked through the lively resting area and walked towards the quiet warehouse. After walking for a long time, only the muffled sound of his hard military boots hitting the composite floor could be heard in the quiet interior of the spaceship. Schuyler silently opened an electronic door beside him, walked in, and then quickly closed the door. There was no one else here, so it was absolutely quiet. Behind him was the laundry room, and hundreds of meters below him was the energy control room of the Federation's warship. Listening to the sound of rolling machinery, splashing water, and the low humming of the crystal engine of the warship below his feet, Schuyler took off his sunglasses and wiped the cold sweat on his forehead. He felt that his legs were somewhat weak. The national girl's proud acting skills in the arts circle could not fool him. He behaved like a walking corpse, as if he had lost his soul like an idiot. Naturally, it wasn't because of her joke that hurt his self-esteem. The truth is that the real reason why his legs are weak and he is sweating while leaning against the cold wall of the Sundry's cabin is because he was in the room earlier. He suddenly thinks of what Li Xiuzhu said in the villa in Choming Mountain and Li Xiaotong's weird expression in the autumn wind at the highway intersection. A crazy and absurd idea faintly emerges in his mind. This blind date. I'm afraid it really isn't a joke by a superstar. But this matter is too unreasonable. Schuler stared at the metal junk in front of him in confusion and muttered to himself in disbelief. Could it be that the Department of Defense is also a professional matchmaking agency? For many days after that, the journey to the West Woods on the warship was peaceful. Under the glory of the charter, even the boorish interstellar pirates would not be stupid enough to enter the Federation's starfield. 3 days later, the warship finished accelerating in the star system and officially entered outer space. Even the low humming of the crystal engine could no longer be heard. The long journey in outer space was only boring silence. After the staff changed shifts, they would go to the living area to drink a few glasses of wine, play chess, chat, and watch TV and movies to pass the time. In addition to the staff of the performing arts team, the officers and the members of Group 7 were secretly looking forward to whether or not the national girl, who was doted on by thousands of people, would come down the gangway to have fun with them. After traveling with the legendary Jen Shueya for more than a month, it would be a pity if they could not see the real face of this superstar with their own eyes. However, to their disappointment, since that day, the nation's girl locked herself in her room. No one knew how she spent her time alone in the bedroom, whether she felt lonely, or whether she was bored looking at the unchanging background of the universe outside the floor-to-ceiling window. There were very few people who had the authority to enter the core area of the upper layer. Sister Tong and 2 female assistants were in charge of Jen Shueya's daily necessities. Other than that, only the 3 highest-ranking officers of the warship and 2 or 3 members of Group 7 were allowed to set foot in that forbidden area. Schuler had the authority to go up and ask about the loneliness of the national girl, but of course, he did not dare to go. He could even vaguely guess why Jen Shueya locked herself in her room. After passing through the Voidman space passage at the edge of the upper forest district, the warship entered full speed. The traces left by humans in the universe became fewer and fewer. Other than the monitoring satellites set up by the Bureau of Proclamation in the distant asteroid belt, everything returned to a rather solemn and beautiful primitive state. Jen Shueya still did not come downstairs. The expectant crowd could not help but feel a little disappointed, but they were not too angry. After all, this was the national girl among the stars. It was natural for her to keep a certain distance from people like them. Not to mention, in the Federation, this female star had always been known for her mysterious aura. During these days, Schuler did not allow himself to be idle. After leaving the security work to Bai Yulon, he was very relieved to wander around the interior of the warship. In fact, it was not accurate to say that he was wandering around, because most of the time, he stayed in the top-secret multi-engine control cabin and the warship's control room. He was like a repairman, but also like a curious child, gently touching everywhere, and sometimes even using his nose to sniff. He carried a bag of buns in one hand and an electronic notebook in the other. He stayed in these important cabins of the Federation's warship for a day and a night. Only when he was tired would he go back to the living quarters to rest. He carefully studied the structure and details of the Federation's second-generation space warship, diligently copying and learning. When he encountered something he didn't understand, he would earnestly consult the mechanics on the warship. He even specially applied for a long-distance interplanetary encrypted communication line from the control room of the warship, so that he could contact Shang Qiu, who was far away in the capital ring, with the information he came in contact with on the warship, requesting her technical support. The officers on the warship had always maintained a strong sense of vigilance and suspicion towards this outsider who entered and left the restricted area. They did not understand why the captain would issue an order to allow this person to enter and leave the most confidential area. It should be known that the area Schuler entered and left involved the engines, transmissions, and weapons systems of the Federation space warships. These were the most confidential of secrets. This person was only the head of security at White Water Company. Why would he have such special authority? The normal officers did not understand why the captain had given Schuler this authority. It was because they did not know that Schuler was originally a lieutenant colonel of the Federation's General Assembly Base, and also had the Level 1 technical supervisor authority of Nutshell. As an engineer who had made great contributions to the new MX Mecha model of the Federation, when he expressed his curiosity about the three major systems of the warship, the captain had no qualms about giving him this authority. Fortunately, Schuler spent most of his time in the process of studying, visiting, and researching. Other than occasionally asking the mecha operator for advice, he was exceptionally quiet and silent most of the time. He definitely did not disturb the normal operations of the warship, and his face always carried a sincere and amiable smile. As time passed, the officers and soldiers on the warship had also gotten used to the existence of this strange person. In the database of Professor Shen Yulin at the Husk Institute, Schuler had once studied a great deal of material science knowledge. In order to wake him up, the Federal Central Computer had once forced many intricate blueprints into his mind. Now, on this long journey aboard the Federation's most advanced warship, it gave Schuler the perfect opportunity to compare the theoretical knowledge in his mind with practical experience. Of course, he would not miss this opportunity. The comparison between the multi-engine systems of the space warship and the dual-engine systems of the MX Mecha was the focus of his research these past few days. The operating principles and compatibility of the three major systems of the warship were also things he was concerned about. The reason why he was so obsessed with studying these things was not only because of his professional instincts as an engineer, but also because of the influence of his childhood dreams. Before he was forced to flee Donglin, he, who had been regarded as a mecha engineering genius by his uncle, his greatest wish in this life was to become a mecha operator under the command of a female captain of a Weiswa warship. Other than that, he wanted to enter the Nutshell Corporation as an engineer. The captain of this second-level Federation warship was indeed a lady, but she was already over 40 years old and had a poker face. Speaking of which, in the cabin on the second floor was the most famous girl in the Federation, the purple-haired captain. Although she definitely would not really command a space warship. Schuler abruptly came to his senses and quickly rubbed his slightly hot face. He knew that he had been thinking about the wrong things again. In the past few days, he had often been thinking about the wrong things. A light beeping sound rang out. The soldiers who were monitoring the warship's energy status in the third control room reflexively glanced at the buzzing warning lights. With practiced ease, they temporarily stopped what they were doing, leaned against the wall, and fastened their standing seatbelts. B-1288 countdown to warp. All the visual windows of the space warship were automatically closed by a 3-layer composite panel made of polymer materials and manganese-potassium alloy. Following the clear electronic female voice's countdown, the normally operating warship suddenly vibrated. This vibration was not strong, but it was more like a massage. No wonder those soldiers were still in the mood to chat about the movie they watched last night while leaning against the wall. Schuler felt for the electronic notebook in his pocket and used his fingers to grip the seatbelt in front of his chest. He narrowed his eyes to look at the black composite panel by the window. He had already experienced this type of warp many times, so it was not new to him, and he did not have any thoughts of fear. He was just immensely curious as to what the three-dimensional warp hole outside the warship looked like. If it were not for those high-strength panels covering it, would he be able to see the legendary, most beautiful spontaneous energy ray turbulence with his naked eyes? Chapter 381. His eyes narrowed as he stared at the black high-strength baffles. It was as if his gaze was going to penetrate them and look into the mysterious and unknown warp hole. Although he clearly knew that without these baffles, his eyes would have been blinded and the entire battleship would have been torn apart, he still could not control the strong curiosity in his heart. Professor Shen once mentioned in a casual chat with him that there were 3 pearls on the crown of science. The pearl on the left hid the flowing nebula, representing the largest scale of astrophysics. The pearl on the right hid the complicated turbulent rays, representing the smallest scale of quantum physics. The pearl in the middle had nothing in it, representing space physics. However, space physics could connect the largest scale of the universe with the smallest scale of quantum. Unfortunately, among the 3 pearls on the crown of science, the Federation had the least understanding of space physics. They only inherited some research fragments from their predecessors and were lucky enough to find the existence of the warp hole in the vast universe. Then, they used it. Today, the Federation could accurately calculate all the values of the warp hole's activation and use, but they still could not observe and infer the starting background and the internal situation of this space passage. The Federation's understanding of space physics had always been at the initial stage of knowing what it was, but not why it was. This point could not be compared to the mature hydrogen energy and geothermal energy extraction technology, as well as the epoch-making energy transmission revolution of the Jingnong style. In this regard, Professor Shen once had a very subtle evaluation. The universe cannot be questioned, quantum cannot be measured, and space is unknown. After an unknown amount of time, the high-frequency vibration of the battleship suddenly stopped. The gentle electronic synthetic female voice removed the alarm, and the standing seatbelts automatically retracted into the wall. The soldiers in groups of 2 or 3 continued their previous conversation about the movie while walking back to their posts, carefully monitoring the changes of more than 80,000 key data in the 3 major systems of the battleship. Shula's squinted eyes gradually relaxed. Outside the window, the black composite baffles had disappeared, and a few lonely stars were suspended in the black universe background. Although he did not have any research on star maps, judging from the star density of this star field, after the battleship passed through the B1288 warp hole, it should not have entered the westwards region. It should be close to the edge of the star field and was still halfway there. Shula retracted his gaze and looked at the solemn expression of the soldiers in the 3rd control room. He suddenly felt that it was inappropriate for an outsider to stand here. A surge of emotion that he didn't know where it came from made him feel a little tired. He lowered his head and was ready to record his previous thoughts on the electronic manual, but his fingers silently stopped. When he was busy visiting and researching on the battleship, apart from his own professional instincts, Shula hoped to occupy all the time and energy to not think about the extremely absurd question. However, at this moment, he realized that everything was in vain. No matter what he was doing, in fact, he had been subconsciously thinking about whether that matter was true or not. What made him feel even more helpless was that after carefully analyzing for so many days with the precise logic of an engineer, he had to admit that this matter could not be any more real. Back then, on the hills on the outskirts of the capital of Hushi State, he looked at the purple-haired girl on the portable TV screen and said in tears that he wanted to marry her as his wife. However, that was just the wanton and boring cry of a young orphan. The tears that flowed were just the result of the uncle squeezing the child labor and making him busy in the pit operation room for too long. It should have been 5 or 6 years, right? Who knew that that boring cry now seemed to have the possibility of becoming a reality? Shula leaned against the wall and lit a 37 brand cigarette. He narrowed his eyes and thought about this incredible life. Although his facial expression was still calm, his heart was already full of tears. The peaceful life of the Federation battleship, as the density of stars in the universe outside the ship gradually increased, was shattered by an unexpected incident. On this day, at 3 o'clock sharp, the members of Team 7, Jiyu Shichuan and Liu Jiao, were talking excitedly in the living quarters. Previously, when they were on duty upstairs, they faintly heard what seemed to be the sound of an intense argument coming from the room. As security personnel, it was very unprofessional of them to talk about their employer's rumors. However, Team 7 was a combat team, after all, and did not have much professional ethics. In addition, that young employer was a target that the entire universe wanted to see, so Bai Yulon and Lan Xiaolong both remained silent. Shula did not go to the lower engine compartment to visit today. Instead, he sat on the sofa listlessly. He listened for a long time, but he still did not know who Jian Shueya was arguing with upstairs and why. Right at this moment, the sound of footsteps came from the gangway up ahead. Ever since Jian Shueya boarded the ship, other than a few people, no one had come down from the gangway. The people in the living quarters subconsciously looked up, thinking that it was probably Sister Tong coming to get the coffee. However, when they looked up, everyone was stunned. Those who were about to lower their heads again to play chess ignored the danger of their necks breaking and forced themselves to raise their heads again. They stared dumbfoundedly at the gangway, staring blankly at that charming purple-haired female celebrity. At this time, there were a lot of people in the living quarters. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were staring at that spot. Even Jen Shueya was startled, but she immediately smiled at the staff downstairs. Her curved eyes looked incomparably cute. "Shu Le, come to my room for a moment." Jen Shueya looked at the pale-faced Shu Le leaning on the sofa in the distance and called out clearly. Then she stuck out her tongue and quickly went up the gangway, disappearing from everyone's sight. The voice that was still floating in the living quarters surprised the people who were already surprised by her sudden appearance. When Jen Shueya's direct subordinates heard this sentence, they were even more stunned and speechless. They had been working for this national girl for many years, but they had never seen her invite anyone of the opposite sex into her room, let alone in front of so many people. Lan Xiaolong held his chin and stared blankly at the gangway. He asked Bai Yulon next to him, "Is the supervisor very close to her?" Bai Yulon shook her head and said, "I don't know." Shu Le stood up with some confusion. He scratched his head and put on his sunglasses. Under the shocked gazes of Jen Shueya's subordinates and the malicious gazes of his subordinates, he walked up the gangway. Halfway up, he turned around and stared at Lan Xiaolong, who was making a funny face, and said, "I'm the safety supervisor. Of course, there are some important things that I have to talk to her about." Even an honest person like Xiong Lingquan would not believe this explanation. If there was a security issue, it would naturally be handled by Sister Tong. Why would the superstar personally come down to invite him? Shu Le walked up the gangway ladder. Among the 7 groups of men and the warship officers in the living quarters below, it was unknown who whistled, but what followed was a roaring laughter. "I don't mean anything else. I just want to apologize for the joke I made last time. You know, when a person is too bored, they will always make some very stupid mistakes." Jen Shueya sat cross-legged on a chair and looked at Shu Le, who was wearing sunglasses and pretending to be cool, 3 meters away. She did not have dimples on her cheeks, but every time she smiled, she would habitually press her lips together tightly, thus forming 2 charming dimples at the corners of her lips. Under the light, they were slightly shadowed and looked very cute. "Ah!" Shu Le rubbed the tip of his nose. Just like those boorish soldiers downstairs did not believe that he was innocent, he naturally did not believe that Jen Shueya invited him into the room for this reason. In contrast, he would rather believe that she had locked him in the room for too long and was too bored, so she called him over to chat. Jen Shueya indeed did not dare to come downstairs because of the awkwardness of that day. However, she also knew that hiding from each other like this was not a good idea. When they were in the West Woods, the 2 of them had to be together all the time. It was impossible for them to have so much space to play hide-and-seek like on the warship. Therefore, she decided to invite Shu Le over to see if he had discovered anything, despite Sister Tong's worried persuasion. This young idol believed that if they did not see each other, the awkwardness would last forever. After seeing each other, perhaps the awkwardness could be removed. Most importantly, on a day like today, if she continued to seal herself in the attic, she asked herself if she was a princess waiting for a warrior. She would be so bored that she would faint. And in the entire warship, there were not many people who could talk to her. "Sit down. After all, this is not the first time we have met. Speaking of which, when we were in the 1st Military General Hospital, I helped you once." "Why are you still so reserved?" Jen Shueya looked at him and smiled sweetly, but in her heart, she thought of the time when she sent this young man to the hospital and hid in his ward for several days. Slightly lowering her head, the young girl waved away those memories in her mind and politely asked him to sit down. Then, like a magician, she took out a bottle of Cattong red wine from behind her. "I'm just a bodyguard." Of course, Shu Le remembered what Jen Shueya said. Until today, he still believed that he owed this superstar his life. However, there were many things that he was unwilling to say, especially in front of the young girl that he liked very much since he was young. Following Li Xiaotong, Shu Le had also enjoyed some luxury goods. He knew that this bottle of Cattong red wine cost more than 20,000 Federation coins. However, what surprised him even more was that Jen Shueya opened the bottle very skillfully. It was obviously not her first time. Could it be that the famous national girl of the Federation was secretly a drunkard? I've been drinking red wine since I was 12 years old. As if she guessed what Shula was thinking, Jen Shueya leaned back in the chair. Her right wrist was slightly lowered as she held the glass of wine. She raised her clear eyebrows and said with a smile, "You know that you're not a bodyguard. After drinking this glass, we're friends." The young girl's words may have hidden meanings, but Shula didn't understand. He just sat down in front of her and picked up the glass in front of him. Looking at the red wine in the glass, he hesitated for a moment and asked seriously, "Can I ask you a question?" "Please go ahead." Jen Shueya looked at him curiously. "What's the relationship between your family and the military?" Shula looked up and didn't hide his confusion. Darkness is just the prelude before the dawn. So what if you're called the son of darkness? If powerlessness is a sin, then is strength justice? From that day on, I couldn't accept this fake life. The wrong time, the falsified memories, the life of an animal, the truth has always been yearning for self. Yes. It's not me who's wrong, it's the world. Chapter 382. The Ministry of National Defense had become a professional matchmaking agency, and the newest warship was specially assigned to Jen Shueya. From the many details that he had access to, Shula had long been suspicious of Jen Shueya's background. However, as far as he knew, there was no one in the upper echelons of the federal military with the surname Jen. There also seemed to be no one in the previous governments that could be suspected, so he was puzzled. Is this very important? Jen Shueya looked at him seriously. Although she knew that he was an officer that the military focused on nurturing and had even received recognition from somewhere, the pressure of her birth since she was young still made her a little sensitive to any inquiries in this regard. Shula lowered his head and looked at the red wine in his glass. He thought that if they were just friends, there was no need for him to know about this. The problem was that for a person like him to become friends with the most popular idol in the Federation, it was no less difficult than Shi Qinghai and Tai Jiyuan going to visit prostitutes with their arms around each other's shoulders. If it was really a blind date, the girl's family background would naturally be the most important thing to check. He raised his head and remembered that the other party had taken back what she said about the blind date and refused to admit it. Naturally, he didn't have the face to continue asking. He could only silently take a sip of the wine, savoring the light and slightly sour taste in his mouth. He didn't know what to say. The silence in the room made the atmosphere a little strange. Jen Shueya crossed her legs and leaned against the round-backed chair. She looked at the young man in front of her through her purple hair. She seemed to be at ease, but in fact, she was a little nervous. At this time, she knew that Sister Tong's advice was right. It was indeed not easy to talk about this kind of thing. Shula was even more nervous than she was. Against the cold backdrop of the universe and stars, he sat opposite his childhood sweetheart like an old friend, gently tasting the precious wine in his cup. What else could it be other than the old saying, "I'm still dreaming, but I'm still in a dream"? How could he not be nervous? Moreover, this young man and woman knew each other very well. Those big shots and those elders arranged this strange trip to the West Woods. Naturally, it was even more awkward. As they drank in silence, Jen Shueya's rosy cheeks blushed slightly. The atmosphere was a little awkward and ambiguous. But strangely enough, when the two of them valiantly endured this most difficult period of time with silence and clenched teeth, the awkwardness and ambiguity became a kind of catalyst, allowing the two of them to gradually relax and quickly become familiar with each other. "You just asked about my family. I'm actually an orphan. The reason why my surname is Jen is because I was picked up." Jen Shueya rested her head on her right arm. She looked at Shula with her dark eyes and said, "I don't know who my father is or who my mother is. I only know that they died not long after I was born." After saying this, Jen Shueya herself felt strange. Why would she tell a person she was not familiar with, who might be her blind date, something she rarely revealed? However, it felt very easy to say it out loud. She suddenly remembered that nearly 2 years ago, in that hospital full of sunshine, when she looked at Shula in the wheelchair, She seemed to have an inexplicable feeling of closeness. Shula's hand holding the wineglass was slightly stunned. He lowered his head and was silent for a moment. Then he forced a smile and said, "Then I'm better than you. When my parents died, I could already remember things, but when my poor little sister left, she didn't remember anything." When talking about the most unforgettable past in their lives, but rarely shown to others, the distance between the two of them seemed to be a little closer. Especially Shula. He peeked at the face of the girl in the chair from the corner of his eyes. Just like when he was watching a concert in Lin Hai, he remembered many things in Donglin and his lovely little sister, Xian Yi. "I was on TV when I was 12, and then I started drinking red wine. Fortunately, I didn't drink until I became an idiot." Jian Shuya rubbed her fluffy purple hair and said with a smile, "Otherwise, Judge He Ying wouldn't have ruled against the UNICEF that year." Of course, Shula remembered this part of the story. He looked at Jian Shuya's face, which was so close, and suddenly found that he couldn't find any adjectives to describe this girl's beauty. It was a little lighter than bright and beautiful beyond measure, but a little stronger than indescribably beautiful. "You are really cute." Shula nodded and said seriously. He thought that a real warrior should dare to face a brilliant life and a beautiful face. "I hate it when people call me cute, because film critics always say that I only know how to pretend to be cute." Jian Shuya pursed her lips, and her smiling eyes narrowed into two curved lines. She said, "The problem is that I was born cute. Why would I need to pretend to be cute?" Shula's body stiffened. He was shocked by the girl's invincible expression until his mouth was dry. He instantly recalled a dream he had once had, the most beautiful dream in his mind. In the dream, he was in a simple primary school in a mountain village. He was walking on the stone path in the classroom for some reason, and beside him was a pretty girl wearing a pair of sunglasses. In the classroom, the national girl named Jian Shuya was playing the accordion, leading a group of tone-deaf children to softly sing a song called Red River Valley. From time to time, she would look out the window and smile at him. The content of the dream was very simple. Shula just kept walking outside the classroom, but his heart was filled with happiness and joy that he had never felt before. In the dream, the national girl sat by the accordion and smiled at him. At this time, Jian Shuya was smiling at him like this in reality. Shula suppressed the waves of emotions in his heart, looked down at the military watch on his wrist, and waited for the number to change on the screen. Jian Shuya looked at him curiously, holding a wine glass. She didn't know why he was silent at this time. When the number returned to 0, it meant that one night had passed by the Federation's standard time. Regardless of whether Donglin was bored all year round, or whether S3 was still snowing, in the Federation's standard time, it was already a certain day in the late autumn of the 68th year of the constitutional calendar. This day was very ordinary. In the history of the Federation's news channel, it was very difficult to find any major event that shook the universe on this day. But for the Federation's expeditionary army and the girl in front of him many years ago, this was a very special day. Shula raised his wine glass, looked seriously at Jian Shuya, and said, "I wish you a happy 19th birthday." Jian Shuya looked at him in shock, and covered her mouth in disbelief. After a long time, she asked hesitantly, "How did you know? If you didn't want to have a lonely 19th birthday, you wouldn't have the courage to ask me to come in for a drink and chat," Shula thought to himself. He scratched his head and explained awkwardly, "I know your date of birth, I know your shoe size, I know your favorite dark chocolate fishman, I even know." He immediately shut up and didn't stupidly report Jian Shuya's measurements. Jian Shuya was the most reclusive female celebrity in the Federation. She didn't even accept interviews, and she didn't even have a management company. Naturally, it was impossible for her to report her measurements to the public. This measurement was obtained by a senior editor of a men's magazine after 3 months of tracking the TV series. It was said to be very authoritative. Jian Shuya put down her wine glass in disbelief. She didn't expect that this legendary lieutenant colonel in front of her was one of her loyal fans. Although her fanatical fans were all over the Federation, she knew very well that Shula was not an ordinary person. Shula finished the wine in his glass in one gulp and scratched his head helplessly. He used the wine to boost his courage, but in the end, he didn't have the courage to say that he had liked her since he was a child, so it turned into a somewhat stupid sentence. I grew up watching your TV series. Jen Shueya was stunned, and couldn't help but spit out the wine. She laughed out loud, but when she found that she had spat the wine all over Shula's face, she couldn't help but blush. She quickly jumped off the chair, found a handkerchief, and handed it to him. For the first time in his life, Shula learned to look at her with hidden bitterness. He knew that he had said something wrong, but what he said was actually the truth. However, facing Jen Shueya who had spat wine all over his face, he couldn't complain, and he couldn't get angry. So, as a pure man, he could only hold a hidden bitterness. Speaking of which, Jen Shueya had acted as an orphan girl in that family comedy when she was not even 12 years old. Shula was only 2 years older than her, which meant that when he was 13 years old, he had started to look at the purple-haired girl on the TV screen, starting a love affair that was countless light years away. After tidying up, Jen Shueya magically conjured another bottle of cat tongue red wine. She raised her glass to Shula and said very seriously, "Thank you for helping me celebrate my birthday." Just as she said this seriously, she thought of the previous scene and couldn't help but giggle again. Shula said awkwardly, "Actually, there are people everywhere in the Federation who remember your birthday." Jen Shueya slowly took a sip of wine. Her eyes were unusually bright, and she quietly looked at the small-eyed boy in front of her. She felt that things in the world were really strange. This wasn't a meeting between an audience and an idol, nor was it a movie about bodyguards. She knew that there wasn't much of a difference between her and Shula, and he wasn't really an ordinary bodyguard or an admirer. Perhaps it was the effect of the red wine, but Shula finally relaxed a little. He looked at the girl and asked with a smile, "Are you very proud of yourself?" Jen Shueya shrugged. She sat on the chair and stretched out her slender fingers. Her fingertips hooked a thin blanket from the side of the bed and draped it over her body. She lowered her eyes slightly, and her eyelashes moved slightly. She said softly, "This kind of pride is very powerful. Celebrities are actually the most meaningless existence in the universe. As for people like me, they are even more of a jinx." Besides the faint self-deprecation in the girl's voice, there was also a trace of loneliness that didn't match her age. Shula listened quietly, and said silently in his heart, "No, at least you've satisfied the spiritual life of many people, like me, like this uncle, like those miners in Donglin who have nothing to do. Tell me about yourself. To be honest, I'm really quite curious." Jen Shueya finished the red wine in her glass and looked at him with a smile. Her appearance was very moving. Shula raised his glass in surprise and looked at the starlight outside the window for a long time in silence. Since escaping from Donglin, because of a certain identity that he couldn't see the light of day, he had never recklessly thought about his past. Today, on Jen Shueya's birthday, did he need to make an exception? Chapter 383. Jen Shueya knew about the relationship between Shula and the new MX Mecha, and also knew how important he was to the military. However, she was still curious about many things about this young man, such as the girl who had testified at Parliament Hill and the minister's daughter who had gotten pregnant before marriage. "I thought about it seriously a few days ago." Jen Shueya raised her eyebrows playfully and said, "You and that minister's daughter have never married, but it seems like no one from the Ministry of Defense has tried to punish you on the spot. Looks like that incident was misreported, or else you were taking the blame for someone else." It had to be said that this national girl would often reveal her lovable side in front of those close to her. But after all, she had lived in the most bizarre circle since she was a child. She was calm when it came to judging people and matters, but she also had a keen eye. In Shula's mind, the girl in the chair had accompanied him throughout his adolescence, as if they had grown up together. After the initial excitement and awkwardness of meeting the idol of his dreams, that sense of closeness that was deeply rooted in his mind gradually took over. He was silent for a moment, and then he raised his head and said, "About me, this is perhaps a very long story. I don't know if you're interested in continuing to listen." Jian Shuya did not reply. Instead, she pulled out a third bottle of Cat red wine and filled the 2 glasses on the table with a smile. At the same time, she tilted her head slightly, lifted the purple hair by her ear, and playfully rubbed her earlobes, putting on an adorable expression of all ears. Shula scratched his head, trying his best not to be seduced by the sight of her slender fingers rubbing her earlobes. After a short pause, he said, "On the first day I returned to the capital ring, on the bus leaving the airport, I took a bag of puppy biscuits." The story began here. Shula, who was narrating all his experiences for the first time, slowly and seriously recounted everything that had happened since he came to the capital ring, including the girl with the black-rimmed glasses, the young spy from the Federation's Investigation Bureau who only liked to smoke number 37 cigarettes and was qualified to enter the Trinity Association, the prince of an aristocratic family who had never eaten scallion pancakes in the mecha combat room of Area H1, and the girl in red who had stopped a black car on the second highway out of the city and cried so hard that her face turned pale. He even talked about the assassination at Linhai State Gymnasium, the creation of the MX Mecha, and many other things that followed. There was no need to keep these things a secret anymore, and he had a need to pour his heart out. In the end, he even vaguely described his escape from Donglin, but he did not go into the details. This conversation went on for an unknown amount of time. The stars outside the spaceship's landing window still emitted a faint light that never changed. The background of the universe seemed to have never changed. Jian Shuya listened quietly, occasionally taking a sip of the red wine in her glass. She did not say a word, but her slightly narrowed eyes grew brighter and brighter. The lines on Shula's ordinary face became clearer and clearer. The national idol was not a good listener, because she would never ask, "What happened next?" or "What happened next?" What happened next? She would not cover her mouth and make a terrified expression, expressing endless admiration for this bizarre and magnificent life story. Shula did not need these things. He just needed to pour his heart out. He needed a quiet, trustworthy, and kind listener. He lowered his head, held the glass of red wine with both hands, and said in a hoarse voice, "When I decided to escape Donglin, the sun was shining brightly that day. There was a lot of dust in the room, like countless insects flying before my eyes. It was also very much like I had contracted the flying grave syndrome. That day just happened to be your 16th birthday, and that evening party was playing on the television." He raised his head, forced a smile, and said, "Actually, the fact that I can remember that today is your birthday has a lot to do with this incident. 3 years ago today was also the day that I decided to leave Donglin." Jian Shuya sat in the round-backed chair like a child. The thin blanket was draped over her shoulders, and her bare feet were tucked under the hemp garment. She tilted her head and looked at Shula with interest. She heard the trace of sadness in the man's last sentence, so she finally broke the silence and asked carefully, "Are you thinking of someone?" "I'm thinking of an uncle." Shula looked at Jian Shuya, lowered his head, and swirled the red wine in his glass. His action of holding the glass with both hands appeared somewhat clumsy. "It was because he died that I had to leave Donglin and come to the capital ring. That is why so many things happened after that. Before the uncle died, he told me not to avenge him, but I had to find out who wanted to kill him. But in the end, I found that the enemy should be a cold machine." He gulped down the blood-like wine in the cup and said with a trace of frustration, "Machines don't have any sense of morality. They just work according to the program coldly. Moreover, this machine seems to have a very close relationship with me now. Do I have to destroy it? Or do I have to make it admit its mistake and cry in sorrow and regret? That old thing does not have tear ducts." If he had not drunk so much, Shula would definitely not have said what he just said. But at this moment, a voice faintly sounded in his mind, "Why not?" This voice was very illusory and disappeared in the blink of an eye. He, who was drunk, did not notice it. Similarly, Jian Shuya, who had drunk a lot of red wine and had rosy cheeks, also did not hear anything different from these words. "I remember my 16th birthday very clearly." Jian Shuya, who had drunk at least 2 bottles of Cantong, raised her arms drunkenly and said, "I'm very happy, not because I can finally buy wine to drink, but because that damn old man of mine prepared a trust gift in advance for my 16th birthday. Here, it's this chain. It looks very inconspicuous, but I'm still very happy. Shula's emotions were still immersed in the sadness of escaping from Dong Lin. Hearing the word gift, he thought of the big uncle who had kicked him into the sewer and gave him a big gift, the bracelet that allowed him to escape death. He had drunk a little too much, so he moved over and placed his bracelet in front of Jian Shuya. At the same time, he grabbed Jian Shuya's arm and looked curiously at the bracelet. There was a row of very small symbols on the bracelet. Under the faint starlight, if Shula was drunk and still had a much sharper vision than normal people, he would definitely not be able to see it. This row of symbols was the ancient alphabet that he had once learned. Hey Jude, don't make it bad. Take easy song and make it better. Sing a sad song to make the world a better place. Jian Shuya pulled her arm back from Shula's hand and said with a smile, so I want to sing. My bracelet also has words engraved on it, but it's a bit old-fashioned, like the stars of virtue. Shula poured himself another glass of wine and drank it. Looking at the bracelet on the girl's jade-like arm, he suddenly had a very strange feeling in his heart. Perhaps it was because of many similar experiences and details that gave birth to a sense of closeness. You sing very well. Shula looked very seriously at the girl in the chair. Looking at her eyelashes that were gradually closing due to drunkenness, he said softly, You're not a jinx, really. Jian Shuya, who had already entered a drunken stupor, subconsciously replied vaguely, You don't know. All the disasters and deaths have been with me since I was born. I am a jinx. After waking up, Sister Tong finished washing up. Then, with a serious expression, she asked the sleepy female assistant and confirmed that the door had not been opened. She turned around and went back to her room. She stared at her watch as if she was looking at a bomb that was counting down. Then, she ate 2 breakfasts, drank 3 cups of milk, and did 50 push-ups. She sat in her room and stared blankly for a long time. However, she still could not make up her mind on what to do. Right now, it was 4:30 in the morning. She should have been sleeping in bed, but she could not sleep. This was because she knew that the miss invited Shula to her room yesterday, and it had been so long, but the man still had not come out. This fact made her very anxious. However, even if something happened between this young man and woman, it was the result of the tacit consent or even the indulgence of the elders. Should she interrupt? At this moment, Sister Tong could not help but sympathize with the young master of the Li family, who had not even held the miss's hand. 17 minutes passed. For her, it felt like 17 hours had passed. She finally could not wait any longer. If the people on the spaceship found out that Shula left the miss's room early in the morning, if this matter spread, what would happen to the reputation of the nation's young girls? How could she survive in the literary circle in the future? She took out the spare key and opened the door. When she opened the door, she was slightly relieved, because the young miss was sleeping on the bed, and the person she was worried about, Shula, was looking at the stars in the universe in a daze by the window, holding a glass of red wine with both hands, and there were actually 9 empty bottles on the carpet in the room. Under Sister Tong's murderous gaze, Shula rubbed his eyebrows awkwardly and walked out of the room. In fact, his alcohol tolerance was not high. The two drank 10 bottles of Cat-Tong red wine in one night. Jian Shuya was already drunk. He also woke up after getting drunk. He had a terrible headache. He walked through the core area passage with a dry mouth. In the quiet corridor in the early morning, only his voice could be heard. However, when he quietly walked down the gangway ladder, he was shocked by the scene in front of him. His legs turned to jelly and he almost fell. The living area under the ladder was full of people. It was not yet 5 o'clock in the morning. People who were supposed to be resting in their cabins were actually resisting the urge to sleep and waiting for something. Most people had even fallen asleep on the sofa. "He's here. He's here." Someone shouted loudly. The originally quiet living area was suddenly awakened. Everyone rubbed their eyes and looked at the gangway ladder. A spaceship officer stood up and looked at the military timer in his hand. He said loudly, 15 hours, 33 minutes, 42 seconds. From the moment Shula walked into Jian Shuya's room, the busybodies on the spaceship began to count down. Many people even resisted the urge to sleep and wanted to see the end of this good show. As the time announcement ended, the soldiers in the resting area stood up and naturally opened up a path. Looking at Shula on the ladder, they began to enthusiastically applaud. There were also ear-piercing cheers and whistles in the middle. The applause was warm and the whistles were everywhere. The resting area in the early morning was very lively. Shula looked at these people stiffly. He was even more shocked to find that, not only were the busybodies and the men of Group 7 in the resting area, even the highest commander of the spaceship, Captain Yi Xiaotong, was here in person. This female captain with a poker face was holding a cup of hot coffee. She smiled and raised the cup to congratulate Shu Le. Chapter 384. Jian Shueya was the one and only national idol in the Federation. She had never deliberately flaunted her purity, but she was a treasure that countless uncles in the universe held in their hands. She was a treasure that they would never allow to be desecrated. To be more precise, those uncles realized that they would never be able to come into contact with this purple-haired little girl. Naturally, they did not want anyone younger, wealthier, or more handsome than them to be able to touch her. Unlike most of the other stars, most of the people in the Federation had watched Jian Shueya first appear on the screen when she was 12 years old. Then, she grew up on TV day after day. They watched the lawsuit that rocked the Federation. They watched her grow from a little girl to a young girl, and then she became the most dazzling existence. This kind of long-term interaction and the feeling of watching her grow up made the people in the Federation subconsciously treat her as a family member. It seemed that no one wanted to see this lovely elf grow up, and they were even more unwilling to think that she would eventually have a love life one day. What comforted countless uncles and aunties was that the national girl had never been involved in any scandals. Since she was 16 years old, her private life was still mysterious and pure. Nothing in the world of fame and fortune had affected her, and it was impossible for there to be any melodramatic love story. Under such a big environment, countless people in the living area of the battleship had witnessed it with their own eyes. Shu Le, this seemingly ordinary young security director, had actually entered Jian Shueya's boudoir in front of everyone. He had even spent a night there for 14 hours. Looking at the mess in front of her, Captain Yang Xiaotong smiled gently. She did not want to embarrass Shu Le too much, so she held the coffee cup and coughed softly twice. The supreme commander of the battleship had spoken. The soldiers in the lounge who wished for the world to be in chaos gradually stopped cheering and whistling. However, they did not stop applauding. Shu Le rubbed his forehead awkwardly as he walked down the gangway with an uncoordinated body. Jian Shueya's personal team had already lowered their heads and returned to their own rooms. The soldiers on the battleship and the guys from Group 7 all stood up from the sofa. Everyone deliberately maintained their silence and stood upright, looking straight ahead. Their military postures were solemn as they clapped. It was as if they were welcoming a chief who had come for an inspection, or as if they were welcoming an unparalleled general who had returned from a bloody battle. Being able to pluck the most tender flower in the Federation was no different from winning a great battle. In fact, this fruit of victory was even more attractive. Such a scene would probably only appear on a warship with a dense military aura. If it were any other place, what greeted Shu Le would definitely not be the glorious applause and welcome, but countless murderous gazes and hidden weapons that would take his life from the shadows. However, this kind of deliberate welcome hid a meaning that made Shu Le feel the most helpless. These bastards. He did not look like a victorious general. With his head lowered, he looked like a deserter. From the corner of his eyes, he saw that many people's faces were almost unable to hold back their smiles, especially Lan Xiaolong and Jiyu Shifeng. Their faces were already red. After going through untold hardships to quickly walk to the lounge, he let out a sigh of relief. He saluted Captain Yi Xiaotong, who was leaning against the door, and explained with a bitter face, "Don't misunderstand." Captain Yi Xiaotong picked up the coffee cup and took a sip. She shrugged and said, "I'm just here to watch the show. You don't have to explain anything to me." Shula turned around and looked at the people in the lounge. He smiled awkwardly and said, "Don't misunderstand, everyone." No one paid attention to him. Lan Xiaolong looked straight ahead and clapped with a fixed rhythm. He lowered his voice and said to the men from Group 7, "Although it's definitely very honorable to follow such a leader, but all the good cabbages are taken by him. What are we going to do?" Xiong Lingquan was more honest and said, "Didn't the leader say that this was a misunderstanding?" "Misunderstanding my ass." Lan Xiaolong said angrily, "Why don't you let me go and misunderstand Jian Shuya for a night? Besides, didn't you see how lewd that bastard was smiling just now? Being misunderstood as having a romantic relationship with the nation's girl, Jian Shuya, was the most beautiful kind of misunderstanding." Just as Lan Xiaolong said, any normal man who encountered the situation that Shula encountered in the early morning would inevitably feel a little smug in the depths of their hearts, along with an indescribable feeling of sweetness. Although after some reflection, Shula knew that this kind of thinking was wrong. At least he did not take Jian Shuya's feelings and reputation into consideration. However, he thought about it again. If it was a blind date, what was there to be afraid of being misunderstood? The so-called men or boys. During the rest of the journey, the people on the spaceship gradually got used to Shula being called upstairs to Jian Shuya's room, although he did not set such an earth-shattering record of 14 hours. People were shocked to find that the nation's girl was probably really in love. If they were not on a spaceship, they would definitely immediately share this explosive news with all their family and friends. Then, the entire Federation might be in a mess. However, only the people involved knew that the truth was not so. After that night of drinking wine, Shula and Jian Shuya, whom he was protecting, did indeed become much closer to each other. However, they were just friends who could talk to each other. They were far from having any romantic feelings. In Shula's eyes, Jian Shuya was still an existence that was extremely distant. In Jian Shuya's heart, this person who was asked to go on a blind date by her family. As long as the word blind date came to mind, the girl would inexplicably feel conflicted and did not want to think about these problems. The storm on the spaceship finally came to an end because of the evening party. Jian Shuya walked down from the core floor and came to the rest area to have fun with everyone. She even stood on a very small stage and sang 3 songs for everyone. Seeing the nation's girl in front of them, the officers were shocked. They stood under the small stage and desperately took photos. However, they collectively became shy and no one dared to approach her. Then, they heard Jian Shuya's witty and cute explanation. Only then did they truly believe that nothing had happened between her and the small-eyed security chief. It was very strange. When Shula said the same explanation, no one would believe it. Instead, they would think that he was a pervert and hypocrite. Jian Shuya just said it with a faint smile, and everyone on the spaceship believed it from the bottom of their hearts. Shula stood in a corner far away from the stage and sipped his milk tea. Looking at the young female celebrity who caused the commotion on the spaceship, a hint of a sincere smile appeared on his face. With Jian Shuya's status in the Federation, there was originally no need for her to explain anything to these people. This was a request he had made carefully yesterday. He believed that from today onwards, no one would bother him again. However, for some reason, after hearing that explanation, he felt a faint sense of regret in his heart. After the evening party, Jian Shuya once again boarded the control hall on the highest floor of the spaceship, causing another commotion. Although the officers on duty could not leave their posts, they could not help but turn their heads from time to time to look at the purple-haired girl sitting in the captain's seat. Shula, who was standing behind Jian Shuya, was even very worried at this moment. If a meteorite appeared in front of them, would no one be able to detect the alarm of the spaceship's central control system, and he would be knocked over? This was a very symbolic scene. Jian Shuya's most distinct image in the Federation was that of the young female spaceship commander in the dark brown lieutenant colonel uniform. Today, she was really sitting in the captain's seat. If the reporters could take a photo of this, they would definitely be able to exchange for a large apartment in the port city. This was definitely against the Federation military regulations, but Captain Yi Xiaotong only watched from the side gently and even explained how to operate Jian Shuya. No one on the spaceship was willing to spoil the mood and raise any objections. If I were the military police, I could have arrested you just now, Shula looked forward and said softly. Jian Shueya, who was sitting in the captain's seat, did not turn around. She only said softly, I used 1.5 years to get my graduation certificate from the Battleship Command Department of No. 1 Academy. I'm not breaking any rules by sitting here. The National Maiden's rebuttal had a little bit of pride and smugness, but then, her voice became light. It's a pity that perhaps I will never be able to truly command a spaceship in my life, even if it's a retired feather rank. Shula was shocked at first, but then he felt the trace of sadness in her words and fell silent. Jingwei 2 was the second satellite orbiting a giant planet. This small planet was not the main administrative planet of the Westwoods region, but it was the most suitable planet for human habitation in the region. The oxygen content in the air was very suitable. Because of the distance from the star and the gravitational force of the giant planet, the day and night were a little chaotic, but the climate was very pleasant. At the edge of the grassland where the planet shone for the longest time, there was a large manor. It was the ancestral property of the Zhong family in the West Woods. On this day, at the outer space base of the manor, a handsome young man of about 25 or 26 years old threw away the golf club in his hand and looked at the subordinate beside him in disbelief. He said, You said. Jian Shueya is coming to the West Woods. My favorite Jian Shueya? Why didn't I know? I heard it's a concert for the military. It was arranged by the military. The news just came from the ancestral home. A trace of ruthlessness flashed across the young man's face. He said, Arrange a spaceship immediately. I want to go back. Yes, young master. The subordinate said hesitantly, but it said that Miss Jian Shueya's team will only stay on the main planet for 3 days. I don't know if it's in time. Of course it's in time. The young man spread out his hands and looked at the star in the sky and the vast edge of the main planet. He took a deep breath and said with great fascination, I've been locked up in the West Woods. I can't go to the capital ring. Now that Jian Shueya is here, of course I have to give her the warmest welcome and let her stay by my side forever. The subordinate wanted to persuade him, but when he thought of the cold and barbaric character of the young master, and that the one in the ancestral home had gone to the front line, he could only keep quiet and began to sympathize with the national girl who was popular across the universe. Today is Christmas Eve, so I'm going to eat and watch a movie with the leaders. I didn't mention a certain someone this time. You guys are not going to ask me to kneel on the keyboard again, right? Horizontal. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.